In the dim hush before sunrise, when night reluctantly loosens its grip on the world, a lone figure moved through the stone corridor beneath Province. The air was cold, so cold it felt ancient, as if time itself had settled into the walls. His torch spat tiny sparks that died before they hit the floor. Each footstep echoed too loudly, like even sound feared to exist in a place meant for secrets, not for men. He stopped before a small archway carved with symbols most priests would not recognize. They were older than Latin, older than Rome's comfort with its own power. He hesitated, not because he feared the riders approaching from the hills above, but because he knew this moment would never come again. Once he sealed what he carried, the truth it contained might not reach another pair of human eyes for centuries. He placed the torch into a bracket on the wall. Its flame flickered across his face, revealing a man carved by duty more than by age. His hands trembled slightly as he knelt before a rough stone altar. Upon it lay a wooden coffer, small enough to be hidden beneath a cloak yet heavy with consequence. The lid had already been opened once that night, just long enough for him to confirm that the fragile parchment inside had survived the journey. He lifted the parchment now. A deep yellow sheet, edges frayed, words written in a script smoother than any medieval hand. It looked impossibly delicate in his calloused fingers. Shadows danced across the lines as if the letters themselves wanted to speak. A distant rumble shook the corridor. Hoofbeats. More than a patrol, an entire detachment. He swallowed. There was no more time. Gently, reverently, he rolled the parchment and placed it back into the coffer. With a final breath, he lowered the lid and pressed wax over the seam. He marked it with a sigil, the sign of a woman standing beside an empty tomb. A shape almost no one living would understand. Then he slid the coffer into a cavity carved into the stone floor. He had to use both hands to move the heavy slab over it, muscles straining as the grinding echoed like grinding teeth. When it finally settled, the altar looked unchanged, unbroken, untouched by human intent, as if the secret had vanished into the bones of the earth. Only then did he allow himself to speak, his whisper lost in the cold. "Forgive us for failing you." A sudden shout from above snapped him back to reality. Metal clattered. Boots thundered toward the entrance. The riders had arrived sooner than expected. The church, it seemed, was no longer content to hunt in whispers or shadows. They wanted the secret buried, and they wanted it buried now. He extinguished the torch, plunging himself into darkness. He stood perfectly still, breathing shallowly, listening as soldiers spilled into the chapel above. Their voices reverberated down the stairwell, commanding, eager, righteous. They were looking for something, or rather someone. A man who had traveled too far, asked too many questions, and carried truths no priest was meant to know. The stone under his feet vibrated as heavy boots marched directly above his head. He could almost imagine the expressions on their faces. Grim determination mixed with the thrill of serving a power that claimed to speak for God. But he knew better. They weren't here because of gold, relics, or heresy. They were here because of a name their masters had tried to erase for centuries, a name that refused to vanish. Mary. Not Mary the penitent, not Mary the broken, not Mary the reformed sinner. This was a different Mary. A Mary who led, a Mary who taught, a Mary who understood Jesus in ways none of the apostles could. A Mary whose words were preserved not in churches, but in whispered traditions, in hidden scrolls, in the memories of those who refused to bow to Rome's rewriting of history. That parchment, now sealed beneath the stone, contained more than forgotten theology. It held a threat, a challenge, a question older than any cathedral. Because if Mary Magdalene had been something more than what the church allowed, if she had been a teacher in her own right, if she had been the one Jesus trusted more than anyone, then everything could unravel. The hierarchy, the authority, the carefully curated myth. All of it. A crash echoed overhead. A soldier had overturned the altar, searching for hidden compartments. Another cursed. A third suggested burning the entire chapel down. Their frustration meant the stone slab had blended perfectly. The man allowed himself a breath of relief, but only one. He knew they would eventually come for him. Secrets demand sacrifice, and this one demanded more than most. He felt for the dagger at his belt. Not to fight, but to ensure he would not be forced to speak. Torture had extracted confessions from stronger men. He backed deeper into the corridor until the wall pressed cold against his spine. The darkness felt alive now, thick, almost protective. Above him, a voice barked orders, and boots hammered down the stairs. He closed his eyes. He thought of the parchment. He thought of the woman whose voice filled those lines. He thought of the fear in the Vatican halls whenever her name resurfaced. He thought of the Templars who had preserved fragments of her truth, carrying them across deserts, through battles over oceans. And then he thought of dawn. Not this dawn. A darker one. The dawn of a world where silence was law and truth was treason. But maybe, he told himself, not forever. Maybe one day the seal would break. Maybe one day someone would find what he had buried. Someone who would understand why Magdalene's truth had to be hidden in the first place. Someone who would finally ask the question Rome feared most. What if Mary Magdalene's story was never meant to be erased? Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Torches flared. Shouts filled the corridor. He straightened his back, placed a hand over the hidden stone as if offering a final blessing, and whispered one last vow into the darkness. Let truth outlive us all. And then the soldiers found him. The first time most people hear her name, it is wrapped in a single word. Sinner. Whispered from pulpits, painted in oils, carved into marble. Mary Magdalene is introduced to the world not as a teacher or leader, but as a broken woman kneeling in the shadows of male holiness. For centuries, children in candlelit churches have absorbed that image. A woman with her hair unbound, eyes full of tears, clinging to the feet of a man who forgives her. That is the version Rome approved. But if you listen closely, beneath the hymns and homilies, there is another Mary, a woman the church could never quite silence. Imagine a quiet chapel somewhere in medieval Europe. Icons of saints line the walls, each face identical in solemn devotion. At the far corner, half in shadow, stands a small wooden statue. It is of Mary Magdalene, but something about her is different. She is not on her knees. She is standing. In one hand she holds a jar, in the other, a book. Her gaze is not cast downward in shame, but outward, as if she is about to speak. This is the Mary who survived in secret. In the official Gospels, she flickers at the edges of the story, present but rarely explained. She watches the crucifixion when others flee. She goes to the tomb while the world still sleeps. She meets the risen Jesus when even his closest disciples are hiding behind locked doors. Yet her presence, so central at the most critical moments, is never fully explored. Instead, centuries later, she is folded into a convenient label, the repentant prostitute. No text in the Bible ever calls her that. No early Christian writer describes her that way. It was a decision, not a discovery, a merging of several women into a single manageable figure. A brilliant act of narrative control. Because what happens when you take a woman who might have stood beside Christ as an equal, and turn her into a cautionary tale instead? Far away from Rome, in dustier corners of the ancient world, a different voice speaks. It speaks from fragmented pages dug out of Egyptian sand, from codices hidden in jars, from texts that nearly didn't survive the bonfires of orthodoxy. The words are faint, incomplete, sometimes torn in half. Yet the tone is unmistakable. In these writings, Mary is not merely forgiven. She is chosen. The Gospel of Mary shows her as someone who understands what the others cannot. When the disciples fall into fear after Jesus' death, it is Mary who comforts them. It is Mary who shares teachings that he supposedly gave her in private, away from the others. Her words are met first with disbelief, then with jealousy. Did he really speak these things to you and not to us? One of the men asks. It is an old question, a dangerous one, because if the answer is yes, then the structure of authority shifts. The hierarchy trembles. The neat line from Christ to apostle to bishop to pope becomes less certain, less absolute. The church no longer looks like an unbroken chain of male leadership. It looks like something else, something Rome was never comfortable with. In the Gospel of Philip, another text buried for centuries, Mary appears again. Not as a footnote, not as a nameless extra in a scene filled with men, but as someone close enough to Jesus to cause anger, gossip, and resentment among the other disciples. The language is symbolic, mysterious, layered with meaning, but one thing is clear. She is not simply a bystander. And beyond these texts, in the hidden teachings of certain Christian groups, in whispers among mystics and early theologians, Mary Magdalene emerges as what some called the apostle to the apostles. The first to see, the first to understand, the first to be told, "Go and tell the others." Not "stay silent." Not "remember your place." Go, tell. That is leadership. That is authority. That is dangerous. Centuries later, when church councils gathered under vaulted ceilings to decide what would be canon and what would be condemned, not every text survived. Some were declared useful for teaching. Others were labeled heresy. Some just vanished, or so it seemed, because even as Rome narrowed the official story, something stubborn remained outside its reach. In remote communities, in the songs of peasants, in the tales of wandering storytellers, Mary Magdalene became something more. To some, she was a penitent, yes, but a penitent with a fierce, burning love stronger than any apostle's fear. To others, she was a wise woman, a figure of secret knowledge, a bridge between human suffering and divine compassion. In a few daring traditions, she was even honored as a teacher in her own right, a woman whose understanding of Christ was deeper than the church dared admit. This divergence, this split between the Mary of doctrine and the Mary of memory, created tension that never truly disappeared. The Vatican could decree, could preach, could threaten, but it could not entirely erase the stories people told in their homes, in the fields at night by the fire, in the dim corners of monasteries, among dusty stacks of forbidden writings. Some monks read more than they were supposed to. They copied texts by hand, tracing each letter carefully, knowing that what they preserved could cost them everything. In those cramped scriptoria, by the light of flickering candles, the alternative picture of Mary survived, quietly, defiantly. A woman not contained by Rome. Over time, the church worked tirelessly to reinforce the safe image. Paintings commissioned for cathedrals showed Magdalene half-naked, hair spilling like a curtain of shame, always weeping, always repentant. Sermons dwelled on her supposed sinfulness, her rescue by Christ. The message was clear. She was a warning, not a model. Yet even in those paintings, something slipped through. Artists could not resist giving her eyes that held too much intelligence, too much depth. She looked less like a shattered soul, and more like someone who had seen things no one else could bear. In certain regions, especially in southern France, an entirely different devotion emerged. Pilgrims walked to caves, not basilicas. They lit candles in places where legend said Mary had lived out her final years, not in churches named after male saints. There, she wasn't the fallen woman healed by Christ. She was the one who carried his message across the sea, who preached, who taught, who outlived the empire that tried to soften her into obedience. This is the tension that runs beneath Christian history like a hidden river. The official Magdalene and the forbidden Magdalene. One safely framed by sin and forgiveness, the other breaking through that frame, standing upright, speaking with authority. Rome could write decrees, could shape doctrine. It could burn texts and excommunicate those who read them. But it could not stop people from wondering. It could not erase the uncomfortable questions. Why is Mary the first witness to the resurrection, yet given so few words in the accepted Gospels? Why did some early Christians call her a beloved disciple? Why did later leaders feel the need to redefine her as a prostitute when no scripture called her that? Questions like these are cracks in the facade. And through those cracks, light escapes. That light attracted not just theologians and mystics, but also those who lived closer to the frontier between faith and power, the men who went to the Holy Land, who walked the same dust, who entered underground chambers and found scrolls forgotten by time. Men like the Knights Templar. By the time their white mantles appeared in the story, the battle over Mary's image had raged for centuries. The Vatican had crafted a version it could control. The people, in scattered pockets, clung to something older, wilder, more dangerous. Magdalene's true role did not disappear. It went underground, into hidden texts, into secret devotions, into the hearts of those who sensed that there was more to this woman than Rome would admit. And one day, on a pilgrimage that was never only about land or relics or war, certain knights would descend beneath ancient stones and find truths that echoed the whispers the church had tried so hard to silence. The desert has a way of holding memories, not in stones or scrolls, but in silence. A silence so vast, so ancient, that it becomes a kind of witness, recording everything, forgetting nothing. Somewhere in that silence, long before cathedrals rose and doctrines hardened, small communities gathered in circle-shaped rooms carved out of rock. They did not chant Latin. They did not kneel before bishops. They sat close together, candles guttering, the scent of oil and dust thick in the air, and whispered stories that were not meant for imperial ears. These were the early followers of what would later be called the Gnostic tradition, a word that simply meant those who know, though Rome would eventually twist it to mean those who must be silenced. They were dreamers, mystics, scholars, wanderers. They sought not just to obey God but to understand God, to experience the divine directly rather than through the strict hierarchy emerging in the church. And in their stories, Mary Magdalene was not a footnote. She was a revelation. Imagine one of these gatherings. A clay lamp flickers. A teacher, an old woman with deep lines etched by sun and sorrow, holds a worn piece of parchment. Her voice is raspy, but steady when she reads. And the Savior loved Mary more than the disciples, and he kissed her often. A murmur ripples through the listeners. The old woman raises her hand for silence. It is not the kiss of the flesh, she says. It is the kiss of understanding. Around her, heads bow. Everyone in that dim stone chamber knows what she means. Mary received teachings no one else was ready for. Outside, the wind blows across the desert floor, erasing footprints. Inside, the truth grows. These early Christians did not see Magdalene as a prostitute or a rescued sinner. They saw her as a vessel of revelation, someone who grasped the teachings of Jesus on a spiritual level deeper than the others. In their writings, she is calm where the others are troubled, certain where the others doubt. When the disciples lose hope after the crucifixion, it is Mary who consoles them. When fear paralyzes them, she steps forward with confidence, speaking words she claims were given directly to her by the risen Christ. Her authority does not come from proximity, it comes from comprehension. It is one thing to follow Christ. It is another to understand him. And according to these early groups, Mary did both. As the old woman finishes reading, one of the younger men asks a hesitant question. Why would the teacher reveal such things only to her? The woman smiles. Perhaps because she asked. Perhaps because she listened. Perhaps because, unlike the others, she did not fear the truth. But the truth came with a cost. The more these groups elevated Mary, the more tension grew between them and the powerful bishops shaping what would become orthodoxy. Those bishops, aligned with Roman authority, with growing wealth, with political necessity, were building a faith centered on order. Hierarchy, obedience, male leadership. A woman standing at the center of the faith threatened everything. So began the quiet war. Church councils met in distant cities, debating which texts to include, which to reject, which to burn. They wanted a Jesus easy to control, a church easy to administer, and followers easy to instruct. Anything that contradicted the emerging structure, especially teachings that placed a woman beside Christ, was labeled dangerous. But in the desert, at the edges of the empire, the suppressed stories survived. Some lived in hidden codices sealed in jars. Others were copied by hand in cramped scriptoria, monks watching the door while ink dried on forbidden pages. Still others lived in memory, passed from teacher to student orally so no parchment could betray them. Whispers became protection. Whispers became resistance. One night, in a small desert cell, 2 scribes work quickly by the light of a single candle. Every few minutes one of them glances at the entrance, fearing the sudden appearance of soldiers. On the table before them lies a fragile manuscript. Missing pages, torn edges, but still legible enough to preserve. It begins with Mary comforting the disciples. It ends with the disciples arguing about whether a woman has the right to speak. The scribes exchange a look that holds centuries of tension. She understood him, one says, and they could not bear it. The other finishes. They continue copying. As dawn approaches, the younger scribe pauses, quill hovering above parchment. What will happen if the bishops find this? He asks. The older scribe smiles sadly. They will call it heresy. They will say we invented it. They will not allow a woman to stand where they stand. And Mary? The younger asks. She will be forgotten, the older replies. Or worse, changed. Outside, the first light of morning spills across the sand. It glows golden, almost like a blessing. The scribes finish their work. They wrap the manuscript in layers of cloth, place it inside a clay jar, and bury it beneath the floor of the chamber. One day, perhaps, someone else will find it. Someone who will understand why it had to be hidden. Those jars, buried out of fear, buried out of love, would not be discovered again until the 20th century. By then, the Church's version of Mary had dominated the world for nearly 1,500 years. But truth waits patiently. The desert preserved what the authorities tried to erase. In those texts, Mary Magdalene steps out from the shadows Rome placed around her. She speaks clearly, confidently, challenging the disciples' fear with spiritual insight they do not possess. And it was these communities, these fragile, persecuted pockets of early believers, who kept her voice alive long after the official church had drowned it in sermons and stained glass. When Rome cracked down, when soldiers raided, when councils condemned, the Gnostics held their ground. Even when their teachers were imprisoned, even when their manuscripts were burned, even when their communities dissolved into dust, they passed on a single unbroken message. Mary was not what the powerful claimed she was. She was something more. And though her name was buried under layers of doctrine, the whispers survived. In the desert, in the mountains, in the hidden corners of memory, waiting for the moment when someone would listen again. Those whispers would reach the ears of mystics, heretics, and travelers. They would echo through centuries. They would become clues the Knights Templar would later follow into the heart of the Holy Land. Long before the Templars uncovered secrets beneath ancient stones, long before the Vatican feared what she represented, Mary's truth survived because a handful of ordinary people refused to forget her. The desert kept her voice alive. And soon, that voice would change the destiny of the most powerful order in medieval Europe. For centuries, people thought the story of Mary Magdalene had been sealed away forever, contained neatly within a few biblical verses, trimmed and reshaped into something harmless. But history has a way of leaving doors half open. And one of those doors creaked open in 1896, when a fragment of ancient papyrus, brown, brittle, ghost-like, was discovered in a Cairo antiquities market. No one realized at first what it truly was. It sat quietly in a collector's possession, like a sleeping ember waiting for a breath of wind. Years passed. Wars erupted. Empires fell. And then one day, a scholar unrolled that papyrus and frowned. The script was smooth, Greek but not quite typical, elegant, deliberate. The parchment was worn in places, missing pieces as if someone had torn out sections intentionally. Yet the words that remained changed everything. It began with Mary, not the Mary of penitence or possession, but the Mary who speaks, leads, questions, teaches. The Gospel of Mary. Imagine that moment. A quiet desk lit by afternoon sunlight, dust motes floating like ancient sparks. The scholar reads slowly at first, then with growing awe. This is not a sinner saved by grace. This is a confidant receiving private lessons from Jesus. This is a woman offering comfort to terrified men. This is authority, and it is written plainly, without hesitation, without apology. Now imagine the shock if such a book had surfaced in medieval Europe, an era ruled by bishops, power, and fear. Imagine dropping that parchment into the hands of men sworn to obedience but thirsty for truth. Imagine handing it to the Knights Templar. Before we reach them, though, we must understand just how dangerous the gospel is. The text begins after the resurrection, not before. The disciples are frightened. confused, grieving, unsure if anything Jesus told them still holds meaning now that he is gone. And then Mary steps forward, calm, collected, certain. "Do not weep," she tells them. "Do not grieve." She speaks as someone who has already walked through the darkness they fear. The disciples ask her to share what she knows, what Jesus told her privately. And she does. Her voice is steady, her words filled with symbolic meaning, guiding them deeper into spiritual understanding. She tells of visions, of ascensions, of the soul's struggle to rise through the powers that bind it. This is not the teaching of someone on the outside. This is the inner circle. This is intimacy of the mind, not the flesh intimacy of insight. But when she finishes speaking, something predictable and painfully human happens. They doubt her. Peter, the same Peter on whom Rome claims its apostolic authority, challenges her. "Did he truly speak these things to you? Or are you inventing them?" His voice is not fear. It is jealousy. Another disciple steps forward to defend her, chastising Peter. "If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" It is a fight about authority, about legitimacy, about who gets to speak for Christ. A fight that has lasted 2,000 years. The text breaks off here. The papyrus damaged, torn, as if someone centuries ago had tried to silence the very part of the story that mattered most. Yet even in its incomplete form, the Gospel of Mary carries a weight that echoes through time. A woman understands what the men do not. A woman teaches what the men cannot. A woman holds the message when the others crumble. And that is precisely why the text was cast aside, hidden, buried, ignored. Now imagine you are a medieval cleric, trained in doctrine, loyal to Rome. You hear whispers of a text that elevates a woman above the apostles. A text where Peter, the rock of the church, doubts, possibly even fears, her authority. A text that suggests Christ's teachings were not fully given to men alone, but also to a woman who grasped them in ways the church could never acknowledge. It would terrify you. It would threaten every hierarchy, every sermon, every rule. Better to destroy such a text, or deny it ever existed, or, failing that, shift Mary's identity until the idea of her leadership becomes unthinkable. Turn her into a prostitute. Turn her into a penitent. Turn her into a symbol of sin rather than wisdom. That's exactly what Rome did, and for centuries no one questioned it. But hidden far from the reach of the church, under sands, in caves, in private collections, the truth waited. Scholars would later uncover other texts, other fragments, that echoed the same narrative. Mary was not merely a witness but a bearer of knowledge, a teacher whose understanding of Jesus ran deeper than any apostles. The Gospel of Philip hints at an affection between Jesus and Mary that is not romantic but spiritual, an intimacy of shared revelation. It describes her as someone who walked with him always, someone who received a kiss, a symbolic gesture meaning transmission of wisdom, understanding, spirit. The Gospel of Thomas includes sayings that elevate understanding over hierarchy, ideas that align far more closely with Mary's portrayal than with the strict male-dominated structure Rome eventually built. Piece by piece, the portrait sharpens. Mary was not an accessory. She was a cornerstone. But stones can be buried. Paintings can be altered. Stories can be rewritten. Still, a seed once planted does not disappear. It hides underground until the world changes enough for it to grow. This is why the Gospel of Mary matters. Not because it provides scandal. Not because it upends tradition for the sake of drama. It matters because it shows us a version of early Christianity where understanding mattered more than titles, where revelation was shared with those who were ready, not just those in power. It matters because it places Mary Magdalene at the center of a spiritual struggle still unfolding today. Who gets to define the truth? And most importantly, what truths were buried simply because they were spoken by a woman? As the medieval world shifted, cathedrals rising, crusades raging, armies marching, the fragile legacy of these hidden teachings did not vanish. Instead, it traveled in whispers, in secret groups, in the minds of those who sought more than the church would teach, traveled along trade routes, across the Mediterranean, through the Holy Land, through the very earth the Knights Templar were destined to dig beneath. Imagine one of those white-mantled knights descending stone steps under the Temple Mount by torchlight. Imagine him brushing dust from ancient walls, discovering scrolls that should not exist, scrolls that mention a woman in terms no priest would dare speak aloud. Imagine the shock, the awe, the fear, because the Gospel of Mary is not only a text. It is a threat, a mirror, a message, a reminder that truth does not belong to kings or popes. It belongs to those who seek it. And for the Templars, seekers by nature, the discovery of such a gospel would not simply be history. It would be destiny. They came from farms, from villages, from forgotten corners of Europe, men who owned nothing but a horse, a blade, and a desperate longing for purpose. When they first gathered in the Holy Land, there was no prophecy written about them, no whisper of destiny. Just 9 knights, dusty and exhausted, standing under the scorching Jerusalem sun, swearing an oath that would change the world. They vowed poverty, they vowed chastity, they vowed obedience, but above all they vowed to protect. These were not the polished, disciplined warriors the myths later described. They were wanderers shaped by loss, men who had watched their families die in plague, watched villages burn in crusade fever, watched Europe fracture under the weight of its own guilt. And so, when they pledged their lives for Christ's poor, they did so not out of ambition, but out of a deep and aching emptiness. Yet something shifted the moment they donned the white mantle marked with a red cross. It was as though the cloth itself carried a weight older than the church, older than the crusades, older than any oath spoken aloud. They became more than knights. They became symbols. Imagine them riding toward Jerusalem for the first time. The wind carries the scent of dust, sweat, and incense drifting from nearby shrines. Pilgrims shuffle along the same road, clutching small wooden crosses. When the knights pass, some bow their heads, others whisper blessings, but everyone feels something. The sense that these warriors do not serve kings or gold. They serve an idea. Their headquarters were modest at first, nothing more than a few rooms. But then came the moment that transformed them from a hopeful brotherhood into the most enigmatic power of their age. The king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, granted them residence in a place no one had lived in for centuries, a desolate section of the old Temple Mount. Beneath it lay tunnels, forgotten chambers, and ruins swallowed by layers of conquest. The common world had forgotten what was buried there. These knights had not. Late at night, when Jerusalem slept and torches flickered like dying stars, the knights descended into those underground passages. They carried tools instead of weapons, shovels instead of shields. They were digging not for treasure, but for truth. It was an odd thing for warriors to do, but the Templars were never just warriors. While other crusaders sought glory in battle, the Templars sought something else, knowledge. They believed that fragments of ancient wisdom, relics of the earliest faiths, and secrets hidden beneath centuries of dust were waiting for those bold enough to look. And so they dug, day after day, week after week, sometimes finding nothing but stones and bones, sometimes unearthing objects whose inscriptions no one could read. It wasn't wealth that drove them. It was hunger, an intellectual and spiritual hunger that the church could not satisfy. Picture a moment from those early years. A young Templar kneels in a narrow tunnel, his hands brushing away earth that has lain untouched since the age of Solomon. A faint glow from his torch reveals markings on the wall, unfamiliar symbols arranged in patterns that feel meaningful, though he cannot understand them. Behind him, another knight breathes out slowly, and the sound echoes like a prayer. They do not speak. They simply keep digging. Word began to spread in whispers. Some said the Templars were searching for the Ark of the Covenant. Others said they had found documents so old they contradicted the church. A few claimed they were uncovering teachings that would expose truths the Vatican had long buried. And over time, their reputation changed. These were not just protectors of pilgrims. They were explorers of forbidden knowledge. Their relationship with the Holy Land deepened with each passing year. They ate local food, learned local languages, and spoke with Jewish scholars, Muslim mystics, and Christian monks who preserved traditions Rome had forgotten or chosen to ignore. They walked marketplaces filled with ideas, not just merchandise. They entered libraries where scrolls older than Europe lay gathering dust. The Templars listened. They asked questions. They compared stories. And in those stories, they began to hear echoes. Echoes of a woman whose memory refused to die. Echoes of a spiritual lineage that Rome had silenced. Mary Magdalene, not the Mary of stained glass and sermons, but the Mary of hidden writings, desert visions, and unbroken chains of oral tradition. Some of the local mystics spoke of her not just as a follower of Christ, but as a keeper of mysteries. They described her as someone who understood the divine not through hierarchy or dogma, but through direct revelation, an idea that resonated deeply with the Templars, who were growing increasingly skeptical of Rome's authority. Others told them of documents buried long ago, writings that contradicted official doctrine, writings that painted a different picture of the early followers of Jesus. Stories of a woman teacher, a spiritual equal, a guide. The Templars listened with rapt attention. Imagine a Templar commander sitting cross-legged beside a desert fire, listening to an elderly mystic speak softly about teachings passed down through generations. The flames dance in the man's eyes as he hears things no priest would ever dare say. Stories of a sacred feminine, of a balance between masculine and feminine divine, of a partnership erased by power. The commander is silent, but his heartbeat quickens. He knows instinctively that these stories carry a weight beyond legend. They feel like pieces of a puzzle he has been unknowingly assembling since the day he took his oath. Back in Europe, the Church saw the Templars as loyal servants, fierce warriors who protected pilgrims and carried the banner of Christ into battle. But in the Holy Land, the Templars were transforming. With every scroll they touched, every symbol they uncovered, every whispered story they heard, they began to see Christianity not as a monolith, but as an ancient river with many tributaries, some of which had been deliberately sealed off. And in that river, they sensed a current leading back to one woman, Mary Magdalene, the one Rome feared, the one the mystics revered, the one whose story refused to disappear. The Templars' fascination with hidden knowledge grew. Their archives expanded. Their secrecy increased. They became keepers of mysteries, protectors not only of pilgrims but of truths too dangerous to reveal. Europe saw only their wealth, their military strength, their rapid rise. They did not see the deeper transformation. That beneath the armor, beneath the discipline, beneath the vows, the Templars had become seekers of a forgotten legacy. A legacy tied not to kings or popes, but to a woman whose influence echoed across centuries. A woman whose truth the Vatican had tried to bury long before a single Templar ever set foot in Jerusalem. The Templars walked the Holy Land with swords at their sides, but in their hearts, they carried questions. And soon, those questions would lead them to discoveries that would alter their fate forever. Long before their downfall, long before kings and popes conspired to crush them, the Knights Templar guarded something far more precious than gold. Hidden deep within their archives, concealed beneath layers of coded writing, sealed with wax, and protected by silence, there existed a small collection of documents that no one outside the order was ever permitted to see. Among the Templars, it was known quietly, privately, as the Magdalene dossier. Not a single page of it survives today, at least not on the surface of history. But whispers of it linger, tucked into letters, hinted in condemnations, woven into accusations during interrogations. And if we follow those whispers carefully, they form a path leading back to the Temple Mount, to the very tunnels the first 9 knights excavated with their own hands. Imagine this moment. A narrow chamber deep beneath Jerusalem. The air is damp, thick with centuries of forgotten breath. Torches tremble against stone walls carved long before Christ walked the earth. 2 knights stand beside a chest they have just unearthed, brushing away layers of dust. Their faces are tense, not with fear, but with awe. Inside the chest are scrolls wrapped in brittle linen. Strange symbols cover the cloth. One knight hesitates before touching it. "What language is this?" he whispers. The other answers, "I do not know, but it feels sacred." When they carry the scrolls to their commander, he does not allow anyone else to see them. He orders the chamber sealed. He removes the chest under cover of night and locks it within the Templar quarters. Only a handful of brothers are ever allowed to examine its contents, and the discovery is spoken of in such careful, coded fragments that even centuries later, historians are left with only shadows. But every shadow has a source. The Templars had come to the Holy Land not just to protect pilgrims, but to seek the relics and wisdom buried within the ancient stones. And what they found appears to have challenged the Church in ways no earthly treasure ever could. For the scrolls they uncovered, whether Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, or a mix neither scholar nor priest could fully comprehend, contained teachings foreign to Rome's version of early Christianity, teachings that centered on a woman, teachings the Church had gone to great lengths to erase. Mary Magdalene, it is said the Templar commander at the time, Hugues de Payens himself, spent nights alone studying the scrolls, comparing them to the scriptures he carried from Europe. Some passages spoke of spiritual visions, of initiation rites, of hidden knowledge meant for those ready to receive it. Other passages spoke of Mary with a reverence that rivaled the apostles, describing her as someone who grasped Jesus' message with a depth the others lacked. One fragment, according to rumor, described her as the companion, a word that sparked centuries of speculation. But in the context of ancient languages, companion was not a romantic term. It meant partner in instruction, partner in revelation, someone entrusted with truths too profound for everyday believers. Another fragment, allegedly found among the same chest, recorded a dispute among the apostles about Mary's authority. The text echoed the same tension found in the Gospel of Mary, men questioning why Jesus had revealed more to her than to them. For the Templars, warriors who sought clarity in a world ruled by contradiction, this was nothing short of revolutionary. They had sworn their lives to Christ. They had pledged loyalty to the Church. But these writings suggested that the Church's version of Christ's legacy was incomplete, perhaps deliberately altered. Imagine the inner conflict. A knight kneels in prayer, hands clasped, brow furrowed. He whispers to God, "Why would Peter question her? Why would men hide her voice? Why did we not learn this from Rome?" But God does not answer. Only silence, the same silence that holds buried truth. The Templars, however, were not naive. They understood the consequences of revealing what they had found. To elevate Mary Magdalene as Christ's closest disciple would undermine the Church's entire structure. It would challenge the legitimacy of the papacy, which traced its authority through Peter, not Mary. And so the Templars did what they always did when confronted with forbidden knowledge. They protected it. The Magdalene dossier was copied in secret, discussed only in closed chapters, guarded by knights sworn to silence. Some say it contained translations made by Templar scholars who risked their souls to preserve what they believed was the purest form of early Christian teaching. Others claim it held maps, genealogies, or accounts linking Magdalene to the region of Gaul, suggesting she had traveled farther and taught longer than Rome admitted. Still others whisper that the Templars discovered evidence she had played a role on par with the apostles, perhaps even greater. What is certain is this: once the dossier entered their possession, the Templars changed. They became more than protectors of pilgrims. They became custodians of a suppressed history. Their rituals shifted. Their symbols evolved. Their understanding of the divine expanded. They began venerating the feminine in ways unusual for medieval warriors. The black and white Templar banner came to represent duality, male and female, light and dark, wisdom and power. The architectural choices in their chapels emphasized circles, not just crosses. Their reverence for the Virgin Mary deepened, but in ways that carried echoes of something older, something closer to Magdalene than to Rome's sanitized Marian doctrine. And the Church noticed. Slowly, suspiciously, uneasily, whispers circulated in Vatican halls. The Templars have strayed. They follow strange teachings. They read texts not sanctioned by Rome. But no one dared challenge them, not yet. Their power had grown too great, their wealth unmatched, their influence terrifying. Kings owed them money, popes needed their swords, pilgrims needed their protection. For a time, the Magdalene dossier remained safe, locked away behind stone walls and sealed vaults. But secrets have gravity, and the greater the secret, the stronger the force pulling it toward crisis. The Templars had found something in those tunnels, something the Church had buried for centuries, something that, if revealed, could unmake Rome's authority. A truth too powerful to destroy, too dangerous to name, too sacred to forget. And it was only a matter of time before someone in power began to wonder, what exactly did the Templars find? What part of Mary Magdalene's legacy had they uncovered? And why were they willing to die rather than surrender it? Power in medieval Europe did not depend on truth. It depended on fear, fear carefully crafted, fear illuminated in stained glass and carved into cathedral stone. And nothing frightened the Church more than losing control over the story it had spent centuries shaping. For decades, the Templars had been tolerated, respected, even celebrated. Their white mantles with the crimson cross became symbols of purity and absolute loyalty. But admiration slowly curdled into suspicion as their influence grew beyond anything the Church had foreseen. At first, the Vatican was uneasy. Then it grew anxious. Finally, it became afraid. Because the Templars were no longer just warriors. They were thinkers, scholars, seekers. They had traveled through lands Rome preferred to paint as pagan or heretical. They had spoken with mystics, rabbis, imams, monks, and wanderers. They had amassed knowledge that did not bend easily to doctrine. And within their private archives, locked behind iron, guarded by oaths stronger than steel, lay writings thought to be lost forever. Texts that elevated Mary Magdalene above the apostles. Texts that portrayed her as Christ's closest companion in wisdom. Texts that contradicted Peter's authority, and therefore Rome's. This was not merely uncomfortable. It was catastrophic. Imagine the Vatican during this time. A maze of corridors and whispered conversations. Priests in long robes stride past one another, avoiding eye contact. In dimly lit chambers, bishops huddle over parchment reports detailing rumors of unorthodox teachings among the Templars. Candles burn low as shadows stretch across the walls like creeping doubts. A single question haunts the room. What did they find in Jerusalem? The Church had spent centuries burying certain ideas that suggested a feminine presence at the heart of Christianity, a spiritual balance erased in favor of rigid hierarchy. But now a militant order, wealthy enough to rival kingdoms, had access to those very ideas. Meanwhile, across Europe, the common people adored the Templars. They saw them as heroes, protectors, and holy warriors. Pilgrims prayed for them. Kings negotiated with them. Merchants trusted them more than they trusted their own rulers. In some regions, Templars effectively governed entire towns, quietly, efficiently, and without corruption. That terrified Europe's rulers almost as much as it terrified the Church. Only one man dared to say publicly what the Vatican whispered privately. The Templars had become too powerful. That man was King Philip IV of France. He was ambitious, drowning in debt, and nursing a paranoia that grew worse with each passing year. His treasury was empty. His prestige was fading. And the Templars held the one thing he desperately needed: money. Vast amounts of it. But Philip feared something else even more: ideas. Especially ideas that threatened his crown. He had heard rumors, strange prayers, unusual rites, teachings that placed a woman at the center of Christ's circle. This, to Philip, was not merely heresy. It was an insult to the very order he believed God had ordained. He began to watch the Templars with the same intensity a hawk uses before it strikes. He planted spies, bribed informants, listened to every rumor regardless of how absurd. And slowly a plan took shape, not just to seize their wealth but to destroy them utterly. But before he could act, he needed Rome on his side. Pope Clement V was not a strong pope. He was mild, cautious, and painfully aware that he owed his position to Philip. Rome had manipulated kings before, but this time the dynamic reversed. The king manipulated Rome. Whenever Clement hesitated, Philip leaned harder. "Your Holiness," Philip wrote in one letter, "we must purify the Church." Purify, a carefully chosen word. What Philip really meant was, "Help me crush them, or I will claim the Church shelters heretics." The Pope stalled for months, hoping the problem would resolve itself. But rumors, fueled by Philip, kept growing. Some said the Templars worshipped a head. Others said they denied Christ. Still others whispered that they held forbidden texts, forbidden teachings, forbidden relics. No one dared mention Magdalene openly, but her shadow lay behind every accusation. Meanwhile, inside the order, the Templars sensed a storm gathering. Messages from France grew increasingly hostile. Spies followed their movements. Royal officials demanded access to their archives. And yet, despite mounting danger, the Templars did not yield. They had faced death in battle countless times. Why fear a king's threats? Because they underestimated him. Philip knew he could never defeat them on the battlefield. They were too disciplined, too loyal, too beloved by the people. So he struck at their greatest vulnerability, their devotion to secrecy. In the medieval world, secrecy bred suspicion. Philip exploited that suspicion ruthlessly. He insisted that any secret ritual must be hiding evil. Any concealed teaching must be heresy. Any unexplained artifact must be blasphemous. And the Church, already anxious about what the Templars had found beneath Jerusalem, began to waver. Imagine Pope Clement lying awake in his private chambers. The room is silent except for the distant tolling of a monastery bell. On a table near his bed lies a sealed parchment sent by Philip, accusing the Templars of heresy so vile that even reading the charges feels like poison. The Pope closes his eyes. He knows the accusations are exaggerated, perhaps fabricated. But he also knows the Templars possess something Rome cannot control. Writings, teachings, ideas that elevate a woman to spiritual authority. Ideas powerful enough to shake the foundations of the Church. In that moment, Clement makes the decision history will remember him for. He chooses fear over truth. While Rome hesitates, Philip acts. In the months leading to their destruction, the Templars try quietly to negotiate, to explain, to assure both Church and Crown that their teachings are orthodox. But they cannot reveal everything, not without betraying the very legacy they swore to protect. And that is when the trap tightens. The Templars' devotion to incense, to secret prayers, to coded phrases inspired by mystical writings, especially those referencing a feminine divine, becomes the rope used to strangle them. The more they try to explain, the guiltier they appear. Europe sees only the surface, an order accused of heresy. But beneath that accusation lies a deeper truth. The Church could not tolerate a group of warriors preserving teachings it had worked centuries to bury. A king could not tolerate an army he could not control. And both feared what the Templars might reveal about Mary Magdalene. Fear became weapon, weapon became law, and law became death. By the time the trap was sprung, the Templars stood alone. Not because they were guilty, but because they knew something the world was not meant to remember. Something about a woman whose truth, if ever revealed, could fracture the power of both Crown and Church. And that truth was nearing its breaking point. Night fell over France like a shroud. A cold, windless darkness. The kind that presses flat against windows and makes village dogs whimper in their sleep. October 13th, 1307. A date that would scar itself into history. A date that did not begin with war cries or banners, but with silence. Every town, every fortress, every Templar commandery slept under that silence. Inside their stone walls, Templar brothers knelt in prayer. Some polished armor. Some whispered chapters of scripture from memory. Some wrote letters home that would never be read. None of them knew that, across the kingdom, messengers galloped through the night with sealed orders clutched tight against their chests. Orders that had been written in absolute secrecy. Orders opened at the exact same hour. Orders that carried a single command. Arrest every Templar. Immediately, without warning, the king's seal burned red on every parchment like a wound. Just before dawn, as the sky hovered between black and gray, soldiers began to gather outside Templar compounds. Thousands of men, royal guards, mercenaries, debt collectors dressed like soldiers desperate for coin, surrounded the walls. Torches flamed in the pre-dawn haze, their smoke rising like dark prayers. Inside the largest Paris commandery, the brothers were waking. The chapel bell had just rung for morning prayer. A few knights tightened their cloaks against the cold. The cook stoked the fire for the day's first meal. A squire scrubbed dried mud from a sword. Then came the knock. Hard, violent, final. A Templar sergeant opened the wooden door, expecting pilgrims or travelers seeking shelter. Instead, the door was ripped from his hand as armed soldiers flooded in. The sergeant froze, eyes widening. "What is this?" he demanded. The captain stepped forward and said the words he was instructed to repeat without emotion. "By order of the king, all members of the Order of the Temple are under arrest for the crimes of heresy, blasphemy, and treason." The chapel bell kept ringing in the distance, slow, confused tolls. Across France, the same scene unfolded at the same moment. A synchronized betrayal. In a rural commandery near Poitiers, 2 knights stumbled from their beds as soldiers smashed through their door. In Troyes, a young initiate watched as his mentor, an old, kind knight, was struck across the face with a mailed fist. In La Rochelle, Templar sailors tried to reach their ships but were seized before they could escape. Everywhere, the accusation was the same. Everywhere, the shock was identical. But shock quickly turned to something else. Understanding. The brothers exchanged looks that needed no words. They had known the king mistrusted them. They had known rumors were spreading. They had known suspicion followed them like a shadow. But never, not even in their darkest thoughts, had they imagined this. Not mass arrest. Not betrayal on such a scale. Not treachery blessed by a pope too frightened to stop it. What happened next unfolded like a slow, methodical slaughter. Not of bodies, but of reputation, of meaning, of legacy. Templars were dragged from their beds. Their hands were bound behind them. Their white mantles, their sacred symbol, were torn from their shoulders. Some fought. Most did not. They were trained to fight enemies. Not their own king. Not their own church. In Paris, dozens were herded into the courtyard, forced to kneel in mud. Soldiers marched past with torches, casting flickering light across bewildered faces. One knight whispered prayers. Another stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. A third simply cried silently, tears tracing clean lines down a face coated in dirt. But there was something else in their eyes too, fear. Not fear of death. Templars had no fear of that. Fear of something much worse, whatever the king believed they were hiding. Because Philip IV would never act without motive. He would never risk the church's wrath without a purpose worth the gamble. And deep down, the Templars knew what the king would eventually look for. The hidden writings, the forbidden teachings, the relics, the scrolls from beneath the Temple Mount, the Magdalene dossier. The soldiers, unaware of the deeper currents at play, simply believed what they were told, that the king had uncovered heresy, dark rituals, unholy worship, lies crafted so carefully they spread like wildfire. As the Templars were forced into wagons or lined up for marching, the soldiers fanned out, storming every chamber in search of incriminating evidence. They overturned altars, smashed reliquaries, confiscated chests, tore apart libraries, emptied vaults, but they found nothing. Nothing that matched the accusations. Nothing that proved heresy. Nothing that justified the brutality. Still, they kept searching. Still, the orders commanded it. A single question lingered in every corridor. What secret was so dangerous that the Templars had to be destroyed overnight? Back in the Paris commandery, an elderly knight named Brother Etienne watched soldiers rummage through the archives. A young officer approached him. "Where are the hidden papers?" the officer demanded. Etienne met his eyes and said quietly, "What you seek is not here." The officer responded with a chilling smile. "We will find it, even if we must tear down every stone." The truth was this. The king expected to find treasure. The Vatican expected to find heresy. But both feared something deeper, something that could undermine everything from papal authority to royal power. A secret tied to Mary Magdalene. A secret protected by men willing to die before revealing it. As the sun finally rose, light spilled over France's villages and castles. But there was nothing warm or hopeful in that dawn. It illuminated a kingdom where trust had shattered, where brothers were treated like criminals, where years of service and sacrifice were erased in an instant. and it illuminated a betrayal planned with such precision that no Templar could escape it. Not the commanders, not the warriors, not the initiates, not the priests, not the scholars. The Red Cross, once a symbol of purity, was now treated like a mark of shame. And yet, beneath the shock, beneath the anger, beneath the terror, a terrible realization took root. This was not about gold, not about power, not about heresy invented by a desperate king. This was about silence. The silence of secrets too dangerous to speak. The silence of scrolls no one should have found. The silence of a woman whose true legacy threatened everything kings and popes claimed to represent. As Templars were marched away in chains, one question echoed louder than all the accusations. What truth were they dying to protect? And the answer, still buried beneath stones and centuries, was waiting to be uncovered. The cells were dark, damp, and deliberately cruel. Stone walls pressed close, the air thick with mold and old sweat. The Templars, once feared on battlefields and revered by kings, now sat chained like criminals, their white mantles traded for rags. Many had not eaten in days. Some had been beaten. All of them were exhausted. And yet, the worst had not even begun. The interrogators arrived at dawn. They did not enter with anger. They entered with purpose. Their faces calm, almost serene. Men who believed they were doing holy work. Torchlight flickered across the chambers as the questioning began. Soft at first. Gentle. Like a priest coaxing a confession from a frightened child. Tell us, the interrogator murmured. What rituals did your order perform? A Templar knight, worn from a night without sleep, stared at him. We prayed, he answered. The interrogator leaned closer. To whom? To God, the knight replied. A slap cracked across his jaw. You lie. Thus began the pattern that would repeat itself across dozens of prison cells. The questions were always the same. The answers always dismissed. The pain always waiting. They wanted heresy. They needed heresy. Without it, Philip had nothing. And so the interrogators, trained in cruelty, sanctioned by papal authority, pressed forward, tightening the noose with every accusation. In one chamber, a young Templar barely 19 years old was pinned to a bench. As the torturer tightened the cords around his wrists and ankles, the interrogator repeated a question the church had whispered behind closed doors for decades. Did your order worship a head? The boy shook his head violently. No, he cried. We worshipped Christ. The torturer twisted the cords. The boy screamed. The interrogator leaned in and whispered, Did you worship a woman? A feminine presence? The boy blinked through tears, confused. He had never heard of such a thing. But confusion looked like guilt. And guilt was all they needed. Hours later, shattered by agony, he confessed to anything they asked. He confessed to worshipping a head. Confessed to spitting on a cross. Confessed to embracing a feminine force none of them had ever been taught. And every word was scripted by pain. Across France, the same nightmare unfolded. In a dungeon beneath the Paris temple, an older knight, Brother Garnier, was dragged before a panel of clerics. He had fought in the Holy Land for over 20 years. He had bled beside Saracen warriors and prayed beside pilgrims. Now he stood trembling, bound, stripped of everything but faith. A priest held up a parchment containing accusations. You denied Christ, the priest said. I did not. You spat on the cross. I did not. You bowed before a woman. Garnier froze. The interrogators exchanged glances. It was the reaction they were watching for. After a long silence, Garnier said quietly, We honored the Virgin Mary as all faithful men do. That is not the woman we speak of. For a moment, something flickered in Garnier's eyes, something too brief to read. The interrogator stepped closer, sensing it. You know of whom we speak, he said. Do not deny it. There was a woman the church fears. A woman whose name does not belong in your rituals. Mary Magdalene. The name went unspoken, but it filled the chamber like smoke. Garnier lowered his eyes, and that tiny motion, whether fear, fatigue, or resignation, was interpreted as confirmation. The interrogators pounced. What teachings did she give your order? What secrets did you learn from her scrolls? What visions did she reveal to your brothers? Garnier shook his head. We had nothing of the sort. But the priests smiled grimly. They believed they had found the crack. And in that crack they forced their knives. The questioning intensified. Torture devices were wheeled in, wooden horses, the strappado, instruments designed not to kill but to break. Templar after Templar was stretched, hung, crushed, burned. Their cries echoed through stone corridors, rising like twisted hymns of suffering. Under torment, men said anything the interrogators wanted. Yes, we worshipped a mysterious head. Yes, we kissed strange symbols. Yes, we held a secret doctrine. Yes, a woman's presence guided our teachings. The words poured out because pain forced them out. They became the king's truth. They became Rome's truth. But behind the curtain of torture, another truth flickered. One the church could sense but could not prove. That the Templars had learned something the Vatican feared. That their rituals hinted at a balance between male and female in the divine. That their teachings whispered of a sacred woman who once walked beside Christ. A woman the church had tried desperately to silence. Mary Magdalene's shadow hung over every interrogation, even if her name appeared only once, scribbled by a frightened scribe in the margins of an inquiry transcript. Too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to ignore. As days turned into weeks, the testimonies grew stranger, contradictory, impossible. One Templar confessed to spitting on a cross during initiation. Another denied it fiercely. One claimed to see a mysterious idol. Another had never heard of it. One insisted they invoked a female spirit. Another swore their rituals were simple prayers. Yet the church did not care about consistency. They cared about justification. A single confession, torn from a man screaming, was enough to condemn them all. And so the Vatican, hiding its fear beneath robes of authority, prepared to accept the king's narrative. While this happened, the men who had protected pilgrims for nearly 2 centuries languished in filth, chained like animals. Their hands, once steady in battle, now trembled from hunger and pain. Their eyes dulled, their voices cracked. And yet, beneath the brutality, beneath the humiliations, beneath the lies forced from their lips, a quiet, stubborn truth burned like a hidden ember. None of them confessed to possessing gold. None confessed to treason. None confessed to political plots. But dozens, under torture, spoke of visions, of a feminine light, of a presence who guides, of a teacher once ignored by the apostles. How much of this was real and how much was pain-induced hallucination? No one knows. What we do know is this: the Vatican seized on these fragments with desperation. They shaped them into accusations. They used them to claim the Templars worshipped demons. They twisted the feminine presence into a symbol of heresy instead of holiness. And in doing so, they unknowingly revealed what they feared most: a doctrine outside their control, a teacher outside their hierarchy, a woman whose spiritual authority challenged the very core of ecclesiastical power. As the interrogations continued, as the screams echoed across France, one question hung in the air like smoke. Were the Templars tortured because they were guilty, or because they knew too much? Somewhere, buried in their archives or sealed beneath forgotten stone, was something the church did not want the world to remember. A voice, a gospel, a lineage, a truth. And even as the Templars broke, even as forced confessions mounted, even as the king tightened his grip, that truth remained. Unspoken, unproven, but alive. A truth that once belonged to a woman whose legacy refused to die. A truth the church hoped torture would bury forever. The night the Templars were arrested, a silent race began. One that stretched across mountains, forests, and the dark veins of the sea. Not all of the order had been caught in the king's carefully spun net. Some were away on missions, some on pilgrimage routes, and others stationed in distant outposts where Philip's influence did not reach. These scattered brothers learned the truth slowly, through terrified whispers carried by travelers. The king has turned on you. The Pope has abandoned you. France is hunting Templars like animals. Shock came first, then disbelief, then finally resolve. Where soldiers expected panic, they found something colder, sharper. An instinct honed through years of battle. The Templars did not scatter in chaos. They vanished with purpose. In a fortress near the Mediterranean coast, a young commander named Sir Roland listened to the breathless messenger who brought news of the arrests. The man's voice shook as he described knights dragged through the streets, archives seized, and altars smashed. Roland's jaw tightened. "How many escaped?" he asked. "Dozens," the messenger whispered. "Maybe more." The commander blew out the candles one by one. "Then we still have time." He did not mean time to save the order. He meant time to save what mattered most. Within hours, the fortress buzzed with quiet, controlled movement. Chests were moved, scrolls packed, horses saddled, letters burned. The brothers did not speak of revenge. Not yet. Their task was older and far more sacred. Protect the knowledge entrusted to them. Because within the Templar vaults, scattered across Europe, lay manuscripts copied from the ancient scrolls found beneath Jerusalem. Fragments of the Magdalene dossier, codes, maps, symbols, hidden gospels, writings older than the Crusades, older than Rome's authority, older even than the Church itself. If Philip got his hands on them, everything would be lost. So the survivors chose escape. Some rode north toward Scotland, where the king was friendly and papal influence weak. They traveled by night, cloaked in mud to hide their mantles. They slept in barns, ruins, and caves. They traded horses, changed names, vanished into fog. Others fled west toward Portugal, where the Templars held deep alliances. Portugal's king had long relied on them, trusted them, admired their discipline. They knew they would find shelter behind his borders. There, the order would one day be reborn under a new name, quietly, without the Vatican's approval. But the most mysterious group of all fled south, toward the sea. La Rochelle was their destination, a fortified harbor where Templar ships stood ready. When the king's soldiers arrived days later, expecting to seize a fleet, they found the docks almost empty. Witnesses later claimed that, on the night of the arrests, a dozen Templar ships slipped into the fog and vanished, carrying not gold, but documents, relics, and men sworn to protect secrets older than any throne. Where the ships went, no one knows. Some say Scotland, some say the Azores, some whisper America, but others, those who study symbols and stories, believe the ships sailed first to a much closer destination, the Mediterranean enclaves where Templars could hide in plain sight. As the ships disappeared into darkness, the brothers aboard them stood silently at the rails, watching the French coastline fade. They knew they could never return. The world they had known had been shattered overnight. Their friends imprisoned, tortured, or dead. Their order condemned. Their legacy branded as heresy. Yet none of them looked defeated. Templars had always been prepared to die. But now, for the first time, they were prepared to disappear. On land, escape took a different shape. In the forests of the Ardennes, a small band of brothers trudged through mud and fallen leaves, guided only by moonlight. Their leader, Brother Almeric, clutched a leather satchel beneath his cloak. Inside it were fragile pages copied from the Gospel of Mary and related texts, pages that would be burned instantly if captured. As they reached a clearing, a squire asked in a trembling voice, "Why are these writings so important? Why must we die for them?" Almeric paused. His breath hung in the cold air. "Because," he said softly, "they show that the Church did not tell the whole truth, and kings fear nothing more than truth they cannot control." The squire swallowed hard. "And Mary, what was she?" Almeric looked up at the stars. "Someone Rome hoped we would forget." Elsewhere, in a monastery in Aragon, a lone Templar monk named Brother Matthew wrote furiously by candlelight. He copied, by memory alone, passages from the hidden teachings he had preserved for years. He knew soldiers would come for him. He could hear rumors spreading. But he wrote anyway. With every stroke of the quill, he whispered a prayer. "Let the truth survive, even if we do not." When the soldiers finally arrived, they found his room empty, but the parchment gone. Across Europe, the Templar escape took many forms. Some hid among monks. Some joined merchant caravans. Some took refuge with nobles who owed them debts. Some changed their names and melted into ordinary life. But they all carried something with them. A memory, a teaching, a fragment of a story powerful enough to justify a king's betrayal. And everywhere they fled, these fragments were shared quietly, passed from one safe haven to another, whispered in caves, discussed in secret chapters, hidden in the margins of prayer books, carved into stone symbols that outsiders believed decorative. The Templars had lost their castles. They had lost their public honor. They had lost their banners, their armies, their standing. But they had not lost what mattered. The knowledge remained. The documents survived. The legacy endured. The truth, Mary's truth, stayed alive. And with every escape, the Vatican's fear grew. Because the Church could destroy an order, could burn bodies, could erase names, could defame the innocent. But it could not stop an idea from traveling. An idea carried in fragments by men who refused to let it die. An idea whispered from France to Scotland, from Portugal to the Mediterranean, from hidden harbors to secret brotherhoods. An idea about a woman whose voice had once threatened the entire foundation of ecclesiastical power. Mary Magdalene, the forgotten teacher, the silenced apostle, the one whose legacy the Templars had sworn to protect. And as the fugitives vanished into mountains and seas, a chilling realization dawned over Europe. The Templars were gone, but their truth had escaped with them. Exile changes men. It strips away the illusion of safety, burns away titles, and leaves only what a person truly is. When the surviving Templars disappeared into the edges of Europe, something strange happened. They did not fade. They transformed. Templar ships landed in unfamiliar harbors under moonless skies. Riders crossed borders wearing peasant cloaks instead of white mantles. Documents were hidden in crates marked as grain. Relics were smuggled inside hollowed book covers. And everywhere they traveled, the Templars left faint echoes of their presence. Marks carved into stone, symbols sewn discreetly into cloth, coded phrases spoken only among brothers. They were no longer knights of a great order. They were ghosts. Yet ghosts can reshape the world more quietly, more effectively, than armies. In Scotland, the Templars found refuge beneath the protection of King Robert the Bruce, a ruler excommunicated by Rome and therefore free of papal chains. The Scottish coast was rough and untamed, the wind filled with salt, the hills echoing with the cries of distant clans. Here, the fugitives blended into a land already hostile to the Church's overreach. Local farmers whispered of pale riders who appeared at dawn, helped repair a collapsed roof or mend a fence, and vanished before anyone could offer thanks. Monks in small stone abbeys recorded sightings of warriors bearing strange crosses, praying silently in the dark. And in certain hidden glens, deep among ancient oaks, groups of men met by torchlight. They were not farmers. They were not monks. They were Templars in exile, planning, preserving, remembering. It was in Scotland, many believe, that the first threads of a new brotherhood began to form. A brotherhood that fused Templar discipline with local tradition. A brotherhood that understood how to preserve knowledge without drawing Rome's eye. A brotherhood that would, centuries later, be whispered about under a new name. But Scotland was only one refuge. Others fled to Portugal, where King Denis welcomed them with open arms. The Portuguese king had always admired the Templars. He trusted their wisdom, respected their courage, and recognized their value in defending the borders against enemies. Instead of imprisoning them, he protected them, and then did something remarkable. He rebuilt them. Under a new name, the Order of Christ, the Templars continued to live, train, study, and guard their treasures. The Vatican could not protest. The order was technically new, technically obedient, technically harmless. But beneath the surface, the spirit of the Templars lived on. And with it, the secrets they carried. Some of the most important symbols of the order survived through Portugal, integrated into architecture, rituals, and coats of arms. Churches built under the Order of Christ had unusual features. Circular chapels, feminine iconography, carvings that scholars still struggle to interpret, patterns that echoed the Magdalene legacy, a legacy that refused to die. In the Mediterranean, the story grew even more mysterious. Many fugitives traveled between islands, Cyprus, Rhodes, even obscure rocky outcrops where traders stopped only for water. On these islands, the Templars left behind strange chapels carved into cliffs, shrines dedicated to the Virgin Mary that seemed to hold dual meanings, and symbols etched into hidden caves. Symbols that scholars later linked to the sacred feminine. Symbols that had nothing to do with the Church's doctrines and everything to do with the teachings the Templars had preserved. And then there were the Masons. In Europe, stoneworkers were essential, crafting cathedrals, fortresses, and bridges. These Masons had their own rituals, their own secrets, their own understanding of geometry and divine architecture. When Templar survivors slipped into their ranks, something new was born. At first, it was subtle. A Templar symbol carved at the base of a column. A prayer whispered before placing the final stone. A story shared beside the fire about a woman disciple erased from Scripture. But over time, the influence deepened. The Masons adopted new symbols, circles, triangles, interlocked shapes, that reflected the Templars' understanding of spiritual balance. They adopted new teachings about enlightenment, inner transformation, and direct connection to the divine. Ideas that aligned closely with the suppressed Magdalene traditions. Templar thought blended with local craft, and craft became philosophy. From that fusion, a broader movement emerged. A movement that would one day evolve into the secret societies of Europe. A movement that carried fragments of the Magdalene dossier forward, hidden within rituals, symbols, and coded language. And yet, even as the Templars influenced others, they remained hunted. Rome issued repeated commands to seize the fugitives. Kings threatened death to anyone sheltering them. Priests warned villagers to avoid men marked with the forbidden cross. But fear did not erase them. Fear, in fact, made their legend grow. Stories spread of Templar knights appearing in impossible moments, guiding a lost traveler, rescuing a child from drowning, defeating a band of thieves. Some villagers claimed that the knights were protected by divine forces. Others whispered that they were cursed. But all agreed on one thing: the Templars were not gone. In Provence, where Magdalene's legends were already strong, the exiled knights found something unexpected: villagers who recognized their symbols. When the brothers lit candles in dark chapels, they saw paintings of a woman holding a red egg, or a woman teaching disciples, or a woman standing at the mouth of a cave. Mary Magdalene. Her presence in the region was so strong, so rooted in local belief, that the Templars felt they had returned to familiar ground. They protected her shrines, maintained her caves, restored chapels dedicated to her memory. They did it quietly. They did it lovingly. They did it because her story held something they had vowed to preserve. And with every stone they placed, every candle they lit, every coded carving they etched into wood or metal, the link between Magdalene and the Templars grew stronger, until the line between faith, legend, and secret knowledge blurred. Europe saw them as fugitives. Rome saw them as heretics. Kings saw them as assets or threats. But the Templars saw themselves differently, as guardians of truths too fragile to reveal and too sacred to lose. They had no castles now, no armies, no banners. But they had something far more enduring: memory. Memory of what they had found beneath Jerusalem. Memory of the teachings Rome buried. Memory of a woman whose voice still echoed through forbidden texts. And through that memory, the Templars survived not just as scattered men, but as a lineage, a network, a quiet rebellion woven into the fabric of Europe itself. A rebellion built not on swords or kings, but on truth. In the rolling hills of southern France, where lavender fields ripple like waves beneath the Mistral wind, a legend breathes in every stone, every cave, every chapel bell. It is a legend so old that even the land seems to remember it. Long before scholars debated texts, long before kings rewrote history, the people of Provence whispered a name that Rome preferred to forget: Mary Magdalene. Not the sinner, not the penitent, not the broken woman of doctrine, but the teacher, the wanderer, the saint who arrived on these shores carrying a message that survived empires. Walk through Provence today and her presence lingers everywhere. In roadside shrines, in carved icons, in songs sung by grandmothers who cannot read but know her story by heart. The story begins with a shore. According to ancient tradition, a small boat with no sail drifted across the Mediterranean, carried only by wind and fate. Inside it were several figures fleeing persecution after the death of Christ: Lazarus, Martha, Maximin, and Mary Magdalene. The church eventually labeled the story a legend, a myth for peasants, a harmless tale. But the people of Provence did not treat it as myth. They treated it as memory. They pointed to the coastline near Saints Maries de la Mer and said, "She landed here." They pointed to the mountains near Marseille and said, "She taught here." They pointed to the deep cave of Saint Baume and whispered, "She prayed here. She wept here. She lived here." For centuries, pilgrims walked barefoot to that cave. Some climbed with bloodied hands. Others sang hymns as they ascended. When they finally reached the entrance, they found a place unlike any other. A cavern filled with dripping stalactites, the scent of damp earth, and a silence that feels alive. Candles flicker along the walls, lighting crude carvings made by hands hundreds of years old. Those pilgrims didn't come for a sinner. They came for a saint of equal authority to the apostles. A woman who preached, a woman who led, a woman who carried the teachings of Christ into a world that did not want to hear them from female lips. That belief, simple, defiant, enduring, survived everything the Vatican tried to impose. It survived sermons that painted her as a prostitute. It survived centuries of artwork depicting her half-naked in shame. It survived councils that erased her writings from canon. It survived the slow, grinding machinery of orthodoxy. Because no matter what Rome declared, Provence remembered. They remembered her as the apostle to the apostles. They remembered her as the one who understood hidden teachings. They remembered her as a bearer of sacred wisdom. And this memory was not a vague sentiment. It was a tradition so deeply rooted that even medieval scholars were shocked by how fiercely the people of Provence defended it. Priests trying to enforce Rome's narrative were met not with obedience, but with polite refusal. "She was not what you say," the villagers insisted. "Our grandmothers told us her real story." This local devotion would have remained a regional curiosity, if not for the arrival of the Templars. When the exiled knights first entered Provence, seeking refuge and anonymity, they encountered something unexpected. A land where the memory of Mary Magdalene was not suppressed, but celebrated. It stirred something inside them. For years, they had guarded manuscripts and fragments of teachings that elevated Mary's role far beyond what the Church permitted. They had protected scrolls from beneath Jerusalem, preserved whispers of a feminine light, inherited stories that placed Mary at the heart of Jesus' deepest revelations. And now, here in the countryside of southern France, they found an entire culture that echoed what their secret texts had suggested. This was no coincidence. The Templars settled in Provence more readily than anywhere else. They helped rebuild villages after storms. They repaired roads. They offered protection to pilgrims visiting the Saint Baume cave. They built quiet chapels, modest, beautiful, circular, mirroring early Christian designs rather than Roman influence. In these chapels, something subtle but extraordinary appeared. Magdalene iconography blended with Templar symbolism. A red cross carved beside a woman holding an alabaster jar. A circular window depicting a figure with flowing hair standing before an empty tomb. A stone relief showing a woman teaching men seated beneath her. Rome never approved these images. Rome never commissioned them. Rome never understood them. But the Templars did. They saw in Provence's devotion the same truth they had uncovered in the Holy Land. That Mary Magdalene was more than doctrine allowed. It was here, in this land of legends, that the Templars' understanding of Magdalene deepened. They listened to villagers tell stories passed down through generations. Stories of Mary healing the sick, preaching in the hills, performing miracles, guiding the early Christian community in Gaul. Some stories even claimed she carried a lineage, spiritual or otherwise, that endured in secret. The knights did not dismiss these stories as superstition. They recognized echoes. Echoes of the hidden gospel they had guarded. Echoes of the feminine wisdom the church feared. Echoes of teachings that balanced divine masculine and feminine in a way Rome refused to acknowledge. One quiet evening, in a small stone chapel near Marseille, an elderly Templar named Brother Aymon knelt before a wooden statue of Mary Magdalene. The villagers had carved her not as a penitent sinner, but as a teacher, book in hand, eyes serene. Aymon whispered softly to her figure, "We thought we were protecting you, but you were already here." He realized something the Templars had long suspected but never fully understood. Magdalene's truth did not depend on scrolls or secret archives. It lived in the hearts of people who believed without needing proof. Still, the Templars added their own knowledge to the region's memory. They brought refined interpretations of the hidden texts. They shared coded teachings with local monks and stonemasons. They carved symbols into chapels that scholars still puzzle over. Symbols indicating unity of opposites, sacred marriage, divine wisdom embodied in feminine form. The church tried to intervene, but Provence was stubborn soil. Priests sent from Rome were politely ignored. Decrees condemning the Magdalene legends were folded into drawers and never read. Sermons about her repentance were met with amused smiles, because every villager knew a truth deeper than doctrine. A woman who crossed a sea to preach is not a sinner. She is a leader. A woman whose presence survived for centuries in caves and chapels is not a footnote. She is a foundation. A woman the Templars honored in secret writings is not an error. She is a revelation. Here, in the land that welcomed her memory and sheltered her legacy, the Templars found a sanctuary, not just from persecution, but from forgetting. In Provence, the Magdalene story breathed freely, no longer chained by Rome's version of history. And as Templar refugees blended with locals, trading knowledge, symbols, and devotion, her true image grew stronger, not erased, not distorted, not controlled, alive, a presence woven into the hills, the caves, the stories, the very bones of the land, a truth that refused to die, and that would, in time, become one of the most powerful threads in the Templar mystery. For centuries, the Church taught Europe to fear questions, especially questions that blurred the tidy lines between scripture, legend, and possibility. But in the hills of Provence and the shadows of Templar archives, one question grew too persistent to silence. What if Mary Magdalene carried more than teachings to France? What if she carried a bloodline? The official church dismissed the idea as blasphemy. Scholars avoided it. Priests condemned it. And yet, the rumor lived, a quiet, stubborn whisper that refused to die. It lived in folk tales, in carved symbols, in veiled references within medieval poetry. It lived in stories passed down from mother to daughter, farmer to child, monk to novice. The bloodline hypothesis, the idea that Mary bore a child after the death of Christ, did not spring from modern imagination. Its roots reached far deeper, into the earliest branches of Christian lore, where lines between myth and memory blur like ink in water. It begins, strangely enough, with absence. Nowhere in canonical scripture does it describe Mary Magdalene's life after the resurrection. No record of where she went. No account of her final years. Just silence, as if someone scrubbed the narrative clean. Yet outside the canon, in apocryphal texts and ancient traditions, her story continues with remarkable clarity. Some describe her traveling with companions. Others speak of her preaching far from Judea. A few mention a child never explicitly named, never directly explained, but implied through symbols and metaphor. In Provence, those implications became tradition. The villagers told stories of a woman who arrived on their shores carrying not only her faith, but a hidden light, a seed of hope, a future carried beneath her heart. These were subtle phrases with the weight of careful protection, the weight of secrecy. They avoided clarity, but they hinted at profound truth. And the Templars heard these stories. They listened carefully. For knights trained to detect hidden meaning, these vague phrases were not dismissed. They were clues. Imagine a Templar scribe, ink-stained fingers, weary eyes, copying a local legend into a private manuscript. He does not record it as fact. He does not reject it as fantasy. He simply preserves it, knowing one day it may be part of a larger understanding. The idea of a bloodline frightened the Church for reasons deeper than theology. If Mary had borne a child, and if that child thrived, then the divine authority Rome claimed flowed exclusively through Peter's lineage would crumble. The Church's hierarchy would collapse. Every cathedral, every doctrine, every proclamation based on apostolic succession would stand on sand. Because blood outranks institution, an heir outranks a bishop, and so, if such a lineage existed, it had to be erased. Yet the legends persisted. Some said Mary's child grew up in Gaul and later led a small Christian community in secrecy. Others said the bloodline interwove with local families, merging into history so gently that it passed unnoticed. A few claimed it continued through noble houses, influencing Europe's destiny from behind veiled genealogies. The Templars had access to these genealogies. They had access to scrolls describing early Christian migrations. They had access to local histories ignored by Rome. They had access to documents hidden beneath Jerusalem. They had access to stories whispered by mystics and villagers alike. But did they believe the bloodline existed? Their actions suggest they took the possibility seriously. Across regions where the Templars established strongholds, especially in southern France, one finds an unusual concentration of churches dedicated to Mary Magdalene. Many are built in circular designs, evoking ancient symbolisms of womb, creation, rebirth. In their carvings, she appears not as a penitent, but as a noblewoman, sometimes holding a child. Rome never sanctioned such images. Rome avoided them, yet Templar chapels embraced them. It was not proof, nothing in this mystery is proof, but it was a pattern. And patterns matter when history hides its truths. One of the most intriguing pieces of the puzzle lies in medieval poetry. Troubadours, poets who wandered through courts singing of love and loss, embedded strange references in their verses. They spoke of a rose whose lineage must be protected. They spoke of a holy family in exile. They spoke of sangreal, a phrase later interpreted, perhaps deliberately misunderstood, as Holy Grail, but which in Old French can also mean royal blood. The Grail as a cup was a later interpretation. The Grail as a bloodline was the older one. A lineage, a secret, a living vessel. Whether the Templars believed fully in the bloodline or simply guarded the possibility, they acted as if they were defending more than relics. Their secrecy, their rituals, their reverence for Mary Magdalene, their coded symbols of feminine divinity, their mysterious relationship with certain noble houses in Occitania, all of it suggested a deeper mission. One that frightened kings, one that terrified Rome, one that perhaps even the Templars themselves did not fully grasp. Imagine a council of Templar leaders meeting in a stone chamber, candles burning low. A parchment lies spread across a table, contains genealogical lines old, fragmented, incomplete, names faded, connections hinted but not confirmed. One knight asks softly, "If this is true, if she truly carried an heir, what then?" Another answers, "Then we are protecting more than teachings. We are protecting a legacy the Church buried." But the oldest knight in the room shakes his head. "No, we are protecting choice, the choice to let her story remain whole." For that was the deeper truth. Whether the bloodline existed literally or symbolically, the idea itself carried danger. It suggested that Mary Magdalene was not a footnote but a foundation. It suggested she carried Christ's message and, perhaps, Christ's descendants. It suggested a continuity outside Rome's control. It suggested a lineage beyond patriarchal authority. And that, more than any treasure, more than any relic, more than any secret rite, was what the Vatican feared. Because even a symbolic bloodline changes everything. If Magdalene embodied the divine feminine, and if that feminine lineage continued, then Christianity was not a single, male-centered structure. It was a partnership, a balance, a union of energies, a truth completely incompatible with the system Rome built. And so the hypothesis, half legend, half truth, half forbidden hope, became one of the most carefully guarded threads of Templar lore. The Church tried to scrub it out of existence. Kings tried to silence those who whispered it. Scholars avoided it for fear of ridicule or punishment. Yet the story lived. In songs, in symbols, in Templar carvings hidden under centuries of dust, in pilgrim trails leading to a cave where candles still burn. Somewhere between myth and history, between possibility and fear, between belief and suppression, the bloodline hypothesis continues to breathe, not because proof exists, but because erasing it required too much effort, too much rewriting, too much manipulation, and the harder an institution tries to bury a truth, the deeper that truth roots itself. Whether Magdalene bore a child or merely carried a spiritual lineage, the Templars believed she represented something sacred, something powerful, something worthy of protection, something Rome hoped the world would never ask about again. But the world did ask, and it still does, because the idea that Mary Magdalene carried a legacy of blood, of wisdom, or both changes everything we think we know about history. Long before the Church built its great cathedrals, long before doctrine hardened into stone, humanity understood the divine in two forms, masculine and feminine. Gods and goddesses danced together in myths, balancing sun with moon, fire with water, war with wisdom. Every ancient culture, Egyptian, Greek, Celtic, Babylonian, carried this duality like breath itself. But when Christianity rose under Rome's authority, the balance was broken. The feminine divine was erased with a single, deliberate sweep. No mother goddesses, no priestesses, no female prophets, no woman permitted to carry sacred authority equal to a man. Yet despite this enforced silence, something remained. A quiet echo, a hidden heartbeat, a memory that refused to die. It lived in the margins of Scripture. It lived in the forbidden texts the Templars found. It lived in the figure Rome could not erase. Mary Magdalene. She stood at the center of a forgotten balance, a balance threatened, rejected, and ultimately buried under centuries of doctrine. A balance the Templars, mystics, and Gnostics fought to preserve. To understand why the Church feared Magdalene so deeply, we must understand the concept she embodied, the sacred feminine. Not softness, not submission, not guilt or shame, but wisdom, intuition, equal spiritual authority. A mirror to the masculine divine, not subordinate to it, but standing beside it. In the earliest Christian communities, especially those influenced by mystical teachings, Magdalene represented this principle. She was not merely a follower of Christ. She was a vessel of gnosis, inner knowing, vision, spiritual understanding. In the Gospel of Mary, she comforts the panicked disciples, interprets Jesus' teachings, and speaks with a clarity they cannot reach. The sacred feminine is not emotional weakness. It is emotional truth. It is the capacity to see beyond structures, to perceive the spirit rather than the law. But this was the very thing the early church feared most. Because where the sacred feminine thrives, hierarchy collapses. Where the feminine divine is acknowledged, power decentralizes. Authority becomes relational, not authoritarian. Faith becomes experience, not obedience. Rome did not want a faith built on experience. Rome wanted a faith built on control. And so a system emerged that placed men as the sole interpreters of the divine, men as the gatekeepers of salvation, men as the only legitimate successors to Christ. Mary Magdalene, teacher, visionary, apostolic witness, became a threat so dangerous that her very story had to be rewritten. In sermons, she became a prostitute. In paintings, she became the penitent sinner. In doctrine, she became a cautionary tale. Not because evidence supported it, but because her true role contradicted everything the Church wanted to enforce. The Templars knew this. The Gnostics knew this. The people of Provence knew this. They understood that Christian history had been amputated, its feminine arm severed, buried, and labeled heresy. And where there is a wound, there is always a scar. Imagine a Templar scholar, sitting alone in a dimly lit chamber, reading two texts side by side, the Gospel of Mary and a church sermon written centuries later. The contrast is staggering. One shows Mary standing confidently among the apostles. The other paints her as a redeemed criminal. He whispers to himself, "This is not the same woman," because it wasn't. Rome had crafted a different Magdalene, one who fit their world, not the world Jesus lived in. In the mystical traditions, the Templars encountered Jewish, Islamic, Christian, and pre-Christian. The divine always held a dual nature. God was both force and wisdom, strength and compassion, word and breath. In Hebrew tradition, Sophia represented divine wisdom, feminine in form, equal in essence. In early Christian circles, some believed Christ and Sophia acted together, balancing the cosmos. Mary Magdalene, in many of these teachings, embodied that Sophia principle. She was the feminine counterpart to Jesus' masculine expression. Not his consort in the earthly sense, but his mirror in the spiritual sense. She understood what he taught not because she was favored, but because she was attuned. This was the balance Christianity once held before Rome reshaped it. The masculine without the feminine becomes rigid. The feminine without the masculine becomes directionless. Together, they form wholeness. The Templars saw this balance everywhere once they knew how to look. In ancient symbols, in sacred geometry, in the stories preserved by mystics, in the teachings they uncovered beneath Jerusalem, in the legends of Provence. And so, without openly challenging Rome, they quietly integrated the sacred feminine into their own practices. Small details, subtle choices, hidden meanings. Symbols of a chalice, representing wisdom, not womb. Carvings of a woman beside a spiral, symbolizing awakening. Templar rituals invoking holy wisdom, an indirect reference to Sophia. Chapels built with curves to balance the straight lines of traditional churches. It was not rebellion. It was restoration. A restoration of something Christianity had once known, then forgotten. Rome noticed eventually, and Rome grew uneasy. To a church built on strict hierarchy, the idea of balance felt like threat. To an institution built on patriarchal succession, the idea of female authority felt like revolution. To a system built on singular truth, the idea of hidden wisdom felt like danger. But the Templars continued quietly, gently, subtly. They did not preach the feminine divine. They lived it. In the way they respected women in their communities. In the way they honored Mary, not as penitent but as teacher. In the way they viewed God not as male but as whole. In the way they preserved texts Rome condemned. They understood something that history nearly forgot. When you erase the feminine, you break the balance. When you break the balance, you break the truth. And somewhere within that broken truth lay the heart of the Templar tragedy. Because the church could tolerate warriors, could tolerate wealth, could tolerate independence, but it could never tolerate a reminder of the divine feminine it had spent centuries burying. Mary Magdalene represented the path not taken, the Christianity that could have been. A faith where wisdom mattered more than rank. A faith where men and women stood side by side. A faith that trusted revelation over rule. And that, more than anything else, was why she had to be silenced. And why the Templars had to fall. There are places in Europe where faith does not shine, it glows. A warm, dark radiance, like embers beneath ash, ancient and quiet but impossibly alive. You see it in forgotten chapels, in stone niches along forest paths, in shrines tucked behind vineyards. And most mysteriously, you see it in the faces of statues whose skin is carved not in pale marble, but in black. The Black Madonnas. Dark-skinned images of the Virgin Mary found across France, Spain, Italy, and Poland, some of them far older than the churches that housed them. Medieval pilgrims believed they performed miracles. Local villagers protected them with fierce devotion. Priests accepted them reluctantly, unable to explain why these images existed or why they radiated such spiritual power. But to the Templars, they were not a mystery. They were a message. The Black Madonnas appear in uncanny concentration in regions associated with the Templars, especially in southern France, where Magdalene's memory thrived. Some stand in crypts beneath old Templar churches. Others occupy side chapels built by masons trained in Templar geometry. A few are placed in caves, the same kind of caves where Magdalene was said to have lived, prayed, and taught. Their dark skin perplexed medieval theologians. It cannot be soot, they insisted. It cannot be age, and it cannot be accident. So what was it? To answer that question, we must step backwards, to a time when the feminine divine was honored not as a figure of submission, but as a force of wisdom and transformation. In pre-Christian Europe, black was the color of power. Not evil, not sin, power. Black symbolized mystery, birth, the womb of creation, the depth of night where new things form. Ancient goddesses of wisdom, healing, and prophecy were depicted with dark skin to signify their connection to the unseen. Even in early Christianity, some depictions of Mary represented her as a universal mother, merging old symbols with new faith. But while the Church tried to whiten and sanitize sacred imagery, local traditions refused. And the Templars noticed. Imagine a Templar knight standing in a dim chapel, staring at a black Madonna illuminated by a single candle. The statue's features are strong, elegant, timeless. She does not look like a figure of penitence, but of authority. Her dark skin glows almost gold in the candlelight. The knight bows his head, recognizing the resonance between this image and the sacred feminine teachings the order had uncovered in the Holy Land. The Black Madonna was not the Virgin Rome taught about. She was someone older, someone deeper, someone closer to the earth and farther from dogma. Someone like Mary Magdalene. Many Black Madonnas hold objects associated with Magdalene: an alabaster jar, a book, a red egg, a symbol of initiation. Some chapels dedicated to the Black Madonna were originally dedicated to Magdalene herself. And in regions where the Templars operated, villagers whispered that the Black Madonna was not Mary the mother, but Mary the teacher. Mary Magdalene, a woman whose wisdom was too vast, too powerful, too subversive for the Church to tolerate. In medieval Occitania, Templar knights began quietly commissioning chapels that contained both a Black Madonna and a Magdalene icon. The two figures were placed side by side, their gazes aligned, their symbolism intertwined. Scholars dismissed this as coincidence, but the Templars did nothing by accident. Where Rome saw blasphemy, the Templars saw truth. A truth that could be whispered through stone even when spoken words were forbidden. One of the most famous Black Madonnas, the one at Rocamadour, was guarded fiercely by Templar warriors. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands just to kneel before her. They believed she healed the sick, protected travelers, and granted courage to the fearful. Templar knights prayed before her before going to battle, believing she offered protection older than Scripture. To them, she symbolized the feminine light they had discovered in hidden Gospels, the same light Mary Magdalene embodied. Another Black Madonna, at Le Puy, sits in a town with unmistakable Templar footprints. The church is built atop volcanic stone in perfect geometric alignment with solar events, a design technique the Templars learned from Eastern mystics. Deep inside sits the Black Madonna, draped in gold, her dark face serene and inexhaustibly wise. Templars visited her shrine so often that chronicles record entire units stopping there before major campaigns. They did not pray for victory, they prayed for guidance. Ancient pilgrims said she saw deeper than the sun. Templars said she revealed what Rome hid. In the village of Chartres, famous for its labyrinth and Gothic cathedral, an underground chamber once housed a mysterious dark-skinned Madonna believed to be a remnant of a pre-Christian goddess. Templars helped construct parts of the cathedral, embedding sacred geometry into its design. Some believe the labyrinth represented the feminine path to enlightenment, the inner journey Magdalene described in the forbidden texts. And standing above that labyrinth, overlooking centuries of seekers, was another Black Madonna. To the Templars, she was not a symbol of sin. She was a symbol of hidden truth, a reminder of the divine feminine the Church tried to erase. Why did the Templars protect these statues with such devotion? Because they recognized that the Church's depiction of Mary Magdalene as a repentant sinner was not just a moral lesson, it was a political move, a strategy to eliminate feminine authority. The Black Madonnas, untainted by Rome's revisions, preserved an older memory of female divinity, a memory the Templars had rediscovered in the Holy Land. Imagine a council of Templar leaders gathered in a candlelit stone hall. On the table before them lies a crudely carved Black Madonna figurine, small enough to hide, powerful enough to protect. One of the commanders turns it in his hand. "This," he whispers, "is not the mother. This is the teacher." Another answers, "And this is why they fear us." For the Church, the Black Madonnas posed an ideological threat. Their existence contradicted doctrine. Their influence challenged hierarchy. Their symbolism hinted at a lost truth. So Rome responded the only way it knew, by ignoring them, by dismissing them, by pretending they were harmless relics of superstition. But the Templars did not ignore them. They guarded them. They hid them. They built around them, because they saw in the Black Madonnas what Europe had forgotten. That the divine was once balanced, not divided. That wisdom once had a feminine face. That Mary Magdalene once stood at the center of Christian teaching, not as a sinner redeemed by Christ, but as a teacher revealing Christ. The Black Madonnas became a code, a symbol, a silent rebellion carved in wood and stone. They were not idols. They were reminders. Reminders of the sacred feminine. Reminders of a past Christianity abandoned. Reminders of a truth the Templars were willing to die to protect. And as the Church cracked down harder, as kings hunted Templars, as fire consumed their bodies and archives, these dark-faced statues remained, watching, waiting, witnessing, surviving, because truth, once carved into stone, cannot be burned. History remembers wars on battlefields, but some of the most devastating wars happen in silence, in ink, in sermons, in whispered decrees. Wars not fought with swords, but with stories. Rome's war against Mary Magdalene was such a war. It did not begin with violence. It began with discomfort, a discomfort that grew as her presence in the early Christian movement refused to diminish. She appeared at every crucial moment in Christ's story. She understood teachings the apostles struggled with. She bore witness to the resurrection itself. For a woman to hold such authority was unthinkable in a world ruled by men. So the Church began a slow, deliberate campaign to reposition her, reshaping her image until nothing dangerous remained. It began around the 6th century when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that changed the trajectory of her legacy forever. Standing before a congregation in Rome, he merged 3 different biblical women into one. Mary Magdalene, the anonymous sinful woman, Mary of Bethany. None of these women were the same, but with one sermon, they became one in the eyes of the Church. And so Mary Magdalene became the repentant prostitute. Not because Scripture said so, not because early Christians believed it, but because Rome needed her to be that. Why? Because a weeping sinner on her knees was easier to control than a spiritual leader standing beside Christ. Once this narrative took root, the Church cultivated it with alarming devotion. Priests preached it, artists painted it, monks copied it into commentaries. Theologians used it as moral instruction. And slowly, the world forgot the woman she truly was. But Rome's quiet war didn't end there. After redefining her identity, the Church tightened its grip further, ensuring that no trace of her original status remained. Manuscripts that elevated her role were quietly excluded from canon. Teachings that suggested she had spiritual authority were labeled heretical. Communities that honored her as teacher were condemned or destroyed. The Gnostics, who preserved her voice through the Gospel of Mary, were branded enemies of orthodoxy. The Cathars, who venerated her as a spiritual equal, were massacred in crusades. The Templars, who guarded writings tied to her, were tortured and executed. Mary's truth became dangerous, and in Rome's eyes, anything dangerous must be destroyed. Meanwhile, as the Church sculpted her into a penitent sinner, they elevated other figures, especially Peter. He became the Bishop of Bishops, the foundation of the Church's authority. But Peter's authority was not the threat. Mary's was, because unlike Peter, Mary represented an alternate path. A Christianity shaped not by hierarchy, but by understanding. Not by power, but by spiritual insight. Not by institutional control, but by personal revelation. A path that, if restored, would undermine centuries of ecclesiastical structure. And so the Church fought a war of narratives. At first, it was subtle. Then it grew bold. By the Middle Ages, Magdalene had been so thoroughly rewritten that even educated priests believed the false version. Artists depicted her half-naked with flowing hair, kneeling at Christ's feet in shame. Cathedrals carved her holding ointment, not teaching scripture. Her feast day became one of repentance, not leadership. Rome had won, or so they believed. But truth is resilient. It hides in cracks. It clings to memory. It survives in the places power forgets to look. In small villages of Provence, Mary Magdalene remained a teacher. In the writings of mystics, she remained a revealer of hidden wisdom. In the symbols protected by Templars, she remained divine feminine wisdom. In the texts buried in the Egyptian desert, she remained who she had always been. Yet Rome's war continued into the Renaissance. When paintings of Magdalene grew more human, more compassionate, more powerful, church officials quietly instructed artists to soften her, make her more sorrowful, more penitent, more harmless. When scholars began questioning Catholic tradition in the 1500s, the Vatican doubled down, insisting on her misinterpreted role. Behind closed doors, cardinals debated how much the public should know of early Christian diversity. They feared the rediscovery of lost writings, feared anything that suggested the faith had once embraced a broader, more feminine spiritual foundation. They feared Mary Magdalene's resurgence. And then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the world shifted. Archaeologists unearthed texts at Nag Hammadi. Historians discovered manuscripts hidden in European libraries. Scholars translated the Gospel of Mary. Voices lost for nearly 2,000 years spoke again. And those voices contradicted everything Rome had crafted. Mary was not a prostitute. She was not a fallen woman redeemed through penitence. She was not an emotional follower overwhelmed by grief. She was a leader. She was a teacher. She was the one who understood the message others feared. Rome's quiet war began to crack. But the war was not only external, it existed inside the Vatican itself. Secret debates flared behind closed doors. Some cardinals argued for reconsidering her role. Others feared the consequences. What happens? One cardinal asked in a private session. If we acknowledge her full authority, what happens to the Church's foundation? The room fell silent. They knew the answer. The hierarchy would collapse. Mary Magdalene's restored authority would not be a simple correction. It would be a revolution, a rewrite of Christian history, a return to balance, to sacred feminine, to the early teachings Rome suppressed. And yet, despite these debates, the Church maintained its official stance. But outside Vatican walls, something extraordinary happened. People began reclaiming her. Pilgrims returned to her shrines, not in shame, but in reverence. Scholars embraced her lost teachings. Artists painted her with power, not penitence. Women saw in her a reflection of their own silenced strength. Men saw in her the balance their faith had lost. And in this gradual awakening, something the Templars once protected began to rise again. Not the bloodline, not the relics, not the forbidden scrolls, but the truth. The truth that Mary Magdalene was not what Rome made her. The truth that early Christianity was richer, more diverse, more balanced than the Church admitted. The truth that feminine wisdom mattered and still matters. And this truth, rising steadily like a tide, threatens the same institutions now that it threatened then. Because once a suppressed truth resurfaces, it cannot be buried again. Rome's war was never against Mary the woman. It was against what she represented. Spiritual authority outside the Church. Feminine equal to masculine. Revelation equal to hierarchy. Wisdom equal to dogma. A war waged for power, not for faith. A war the Templars recognized. A war they resisted. A war they ultimately died for. And even today, long after the fires cooled and the swords rusted, the echoes of that quiet war still linger. In every black Madonna. In every hidden gospel. In every cave where candles burn for Magdalene. In every scholar who reads her words aloud again. Rome tried to erase her, but she survived. Not in the Vatican's halls, but in the hearts of those who seek truth beyond the walls of power. Long after the early church councils declared certain writings forbidden, After scrolls were burned and voices silenced, there remained a thin thread of resistance, a lineage of guardians who refused to let truth vanish. They were never a single group, never a unified sect, never an organized rebellion. They were far more elusive than that. Archivists of the forbidden, keepers of the unapproved, quiet protectors of wisdom the Church tried to bury. Their names changed across centuries. Their languages changed. Their rituals changed. But their purpose did not. Some were monks. Some were mystics. Some were scholars too curious for their own safety. Some were wanderers who carried scraps of condemned texts sewn into their clothing. Some were Templars in exile, hiding under new identities. Together, they created an underground network of memory. It began with the Gnostics, those early seekers who believed the divine lived inside the human soul, not in church walls. They survived persecution by drifting to the edges of society. In dim candlelit rooms, they copied fragments of the Gospel of Mary, whispering its teachings to students brave enough to question the Church's official story. After them came the desert mystics, Christian ascetics who lived in caves, writing strange visions and revelations. Some preserved sayings attributed to Mary that the Church labeled heretical. They wrote in coded language, hiding spiritual truths inside metaphors of light, breath, and rebirth. Then came the mystic women, visionaries like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg, who spoke of divine feminine wisdom in ways that echoed the forgotten Magdalene. Though they lived under the Church's authority, their writings vibrated with truths that slipped past the censors. But more dangerous than any mystic were the groups Rome hunted relentlessly. The Cathars. To the Church, they were heretics. To their followers, they were torchbearers of a lost Christianity. To the Templars, they were kindred spirits. The Cathars honored a belief system that elevated women as spiritual equals. They believed in direct revelation, not rigid hierarchy. They believed the divine contained both masculine and feminine. They revered Mary Magdalene as a bearer of secret wisdom. For Rome, that was intolerable. The Church unleashed the Albigensian Crusade, one of the bloodiest religious massacres in medieval Europe, to eradicate them completely. Entire towns were slaughtered, libraries burned, teachers tortured. Yet even in their destruction, Cathar teachings survived. A Cathar parfait, one of their spiritual leaders, might tear pages from a forbidden gospel and hide them inside a hollowed-out staff. Another might pass teachings orally to a trusted friend. In this way, their knowledge lived on like glowing embers buried under ash. Meanwhile, in hidden corners of the Mediterranean, the Rosicrucians emerged centuries later, mystics who blended Christian esotericism with symbols of the feminine divine. Their manifestos spoke indirectly of the bride and the Sophia. Title scholars now connect to Magdalene traditions. And then there were the alchemists, ostracized, mocked, feared, men in flickering labs trying to turn lead into gold, or so the Church believed. But alchemists were never truly interested in metals. Their great work was transformation of the self. In their manuscripts, the feminine principle, often represented as the Red Queen, the Black Madonna, or the Rose, was central. This archetype carried echoes of Magdalene's symbolism. Wisdom hidden in darkness, knowledge rising through suffering, divinity unveiled through inner revelation. Alchemist manuscripts often contained veiled references to a sacred woman whose teachings were misunderstood, a woman broken in public narrative but whole in hidden tradition. To these underground thinkers, she was the missing half of Christianity. And quietly, in their coded diagrams and cryptic poetry, they preserved her. Meanwhile, the Church continued its war on forbidden knowledge. Books banned, scrolls burned, mystics silenced, philosophers imprisoned. But every banned book created a copy. Every burned scroll created a memory. Every silenced mystic inspired another. Then came the Templars, men who had discovered fragments of forbidden teachings beneath the Temple Mount. Unlike the scholars and mystics who preserved such wisdom intellectually, the Templars preserved it physically. They stored the Magdalene texts in secret vaults. They encoded them in symbols carved into stone. They protected them with their lives. Even after the order fell, exiled Templars sought out others who held pieces of forbidden truth. They visited Cathar survivors. They exchanged symbols with Rosicrucians. They communicated with Masons who preserved ancient goddess imagery. They bridged the wisdom traditions the Church worked so hard to suppress. Picture a Templar fugitive meeting an aging Cathar mystic in a candlelit cellar beneath Provence. The mystic whispers, "They erased her to erase us." The Templar replies, "Then we will remember her to remember what matters." This chain of remembrance continued into the Renaissance and beyond. In the 17th century, secret societies flourished in Europe: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Hermetic lodges. Historians often portray them as political groups or gentlemen's clubs, but at their core lay a hidden spiritual current: belief in a suppressed truth, belief in a lost balance of the divine, belief in a feminine wisdom buried by the Church. And woven into these beliefs, often subtly, sometimes boldly, Mary Magdalene. Not the Magdalene of Catholic confessionals, not the Magdalene of penitential statues, but the Magdalene of early Christian visionaries, the Magdalene of hidden gospels, the Magdalene of Templar secrets. Some lodges placed a rose at the center of their rituals, a symbol long associated with Magdalene's lineage. Others placed her initials beside geometric symbols. A few even rebuilt chapels in her honor under coded names. The archivists of the forbidden were everywhere, never in the open, never in authority, never claiming power, but always preserving, always remembering, always passing the ember to the next hand. And though the Vatican managed to silence armies, eliminate sects, and rewrite scripture, it could not kill an idea whispered across centuries. That idea was simple. Mary Magdalene was not what the Church claimed. She was something else. Something powerful, something necessary, something the world was not ready to hear. The archivists did not preserve her story because it was scandalous. They preserved it because it was true, or at least true enough to frighten those who built their power on silence. And so the chain continued: Gnostics to mystics, mystics to Cathars, Cathars to Templars, Templars to Masons, Masons to secret societies. Each adding their own piece, each carrying the forbidden forward, each ensuring the flame never went out. Because some truths do not die. They hide. They wait. They survive in the hands of those brave enough to hold them. Centuries after the last Templar fortress fell, after their banners were burned and their names dragged through the mud, a strange thing began to happen across Europe. In places thought to be sacred or ancient, in dusty libraries and abandoned monasteries, in mountainside chapels and forgotten crypts, symbols resurfaced. Carvings, inscriptions, geometric patterns, frescoes, and seals bearing marks no one fully understood. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, decorative, random, but scholars with trained eyes noticed something odd. The same symbols appeared across regions separated by time, culture, and geography. The same combinations of shapes. The same strange pairings of masculine and feminine imagery. The same hidden letters, the same rose patterns, the same circular codes. And in the middle of this symbolic map, like a ghost returning to claim her truth, stood the shadow of Mary Magdalene. Interpretation of these symbols, still controversial today, suggests that the Templars and their spiritual descendants preserved a coded language, a visual tongue, a secret scripture carved not in words but in stone. To understand this coded language, we must begin with the symbol that appears more often than any other: the rose. A simple flower on the surface, but a symbol older than Rome, older than Christianity, older than recorded history. In ancient traditions, the rose represented feminine wisdom, hidden knowledge, and sacred initiation. Its petals form concentric circles, mirroring the journey inward toward revelation. The Templars adopted the rose quietly. You find it carved into Templar chapels in Portugal, painted into manuscripts saved from France, embedded into tombstones aligned with the stars. Later, secret societies would adopt it openly, calling themselves Rosy Cross, Rosenkreuz, Order of the Rose. To them, the rose was not decoration. It was a message. The feminine truth is alive. But the rose was only the beginning. Another symbol appears just as frequently: the chalice. Not the golden grail of legend, not a cup sought by knights, but an inverted triangle, carved into stone, embroidered into banners, etched into wood. The triangle pointing downward represented the womb, the feminine vessel, spiritual receptivity. Templar chapels often contain both a cross and a downward triangle. Masculine and feminine, sword and chalice, logos and Sophia, balance. A truth the Church tried to erase and the Templars tried to restore. Some carvings show the chalice inside a circle, a symbol many scholars interpret as the fusion of masculine and feminine, the divine union the Church rejected, the union reflected in the earliest Gnostic rituals. And then there is the labyrinth, found in the floors of Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Amiens, Reims. The labyrinth appears as a winding path, spiraling toward a single point. Most tourists walk it without understanding its purpose. The Church claims it symbolizes a spiritual journey. That is partially true, but deeper research reveals something remarkable. The labyrinth is a feminine symbol, a representation of initiation into mysteries often reserved for women. A map not to God above, but to God within, the very teaching in the Gospel of Mary. Templars, Masons, and mystics preserved it because it encoded the lost feminine path of early Christianity. A path the Vatican feared so deeply it replaced it with hierarchy. Other symbols are subtler. The letter M woven into Templar gravestones. The pentagram carved beside early Templar crosses, once a symbol of Venus, not of witchcraft. A red egg, associated with Magdalene's preaching of resurrection. A pair of intersecting circles, the vesica piscis, symbolizing the womb of creation and, in some traditions, Magdalene's spiritual authority. In certain chapels, Magdalene is shown holding this shape in her hand. A subtle act of defiance. A declaration hidden in plain sight. But the most controversial symbol of all appears in Templar churches built between 1150 and 1300. The Y shape carved above entrances and altars. Some scholars claim it represents the branching of life. Others claim it symbolizes choice. But some researchers interpret it differently. A split path, one masculine, one feminine, reconverging at a single point. A diagram of unity. A map to a truth hidden from the world. Two halves of the divine rejoining. In other words, Jesus and Magdalene, teacher and teacher, balance restored. Such an interpretation was unthinkable for the medieval church. Yet the symbol appears again and again in Templar crypts, in Mason manuscripts, in shrines dedicated to Magdalene. As if the Templars were telling the world, the story you know is incomplete. Some symbols were more daring. In a few chapels, those built far from Rome's reach, you find frescoes depicting a woman standing at the center of a circle of men. She is teaching, hands raised, the men listening intently. But her face is partially scratched out, by time or by men who feared what she represented. On her robe, barely visible beneath faded pigment, is a red cross. Some say this was Magdalene. Others say it was Sophia. But many believe the fresco captures a truth the Church could not bear. Women once taught men in early Christianity, and their teachings shaped the faith Rome later claimed to own. One of the most mysterious symbols appears in the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by descendants of Templars who escaped persecution. Here, the walls are covered with carvings of roses, pomegranates, lilies, chalices, stars, alchemical vines, and a woman carved beneath a canopy of vines, holding a book. Local legend says this woman is Magdalene. Her book, the teachings the Church suppressed. The vines, her spiritual lineage continuing across generations. Rosslyn's architecture is entirely intentional. Not a single carving is random. Not a single symbol meaningless. It is a message carved in stone. The Templars preserved what Rome destroyed. In France, beneath the Basilica of Saint Maximin, archaeologists found a strange marking in an ancient crypt, a circle intersected by a downward-pointing triangle. To the untrained eye, it is nothing. To symbol scholars, it is unmistakable. A symbol combining the womb, the apostolic circle, and the sacred feminine. A Magdalene symbol. Was it carved by Templars? By early Christians? By pilgrims? We will never know. But the symbol survived because someone wanted it to. And then there is Spain, where Templar churches contain paintings of Jesus and Magdalene facing each other, their halos touching, forming a vesica-shaped glow between them. To Rome, this would be heresy. To the Templars, it was truth. The coded language of the Templars was not a rebellion. It was a preservation effort, a way to protect wisdom when words became dangerous, a way to guard teachings when the Church controlled every book, a way to communicate across centuries without being silenced. Symbols cannot be burned. Symbols cannot be tortured. Symbols cannot be erased. They survive in stone. They survive in art. They survive in the hands of masons. They survive in the margins of manuscripts. They survive in chapels, crypts, labyrinths, and frescoes. And collectively, they whisper the same message. Mary Magdalene mattered. Her truth mattered. Her teachings mattered. Her presence mattered. And though the Church tried to bury her, the Templars carved her memory into the world itself. There is a difference between knowledge and truth. Knowledge is collected. Truth is lived. And for centuries after the fall of the Templars, a curious phenomenon began appearing across Europe: teachings, rituals, and sacred symbols that seemed to come from nowhere. Practices whispered in monasteries. Prayers that did not appear in any Bible. Meditative rites passed down quietly among craftsmen, sailors, healers, and philosophers. No one claimed ownership. No single person or order declared lineage. Yet the teachings surfaced again and again, bearing unmistakable echoes of the Magdalene traditions the Templars once protected. These teachings were not written boldly. They were not proclaimed publicly. They were breathed from mentor to student, hidden between lines of poetry, woven into daily rituals, carried forward by ordinary people who understood their power without needing to explain it. Their core message was always the same. The divine is not distant. It lives within. It reveals itself through balance. And Mary Magdalene was its forgotten voice. We begin with the mystical Christians, the ones Rome never canonized. People like Meister Eckhart, who wrote that the soul contains a feminine spark. People like Julian of Norwich, who described Christ as having a mother's love. People like Marguerite Porete, who wrote so boldly about divine union that the Church burned her alive. These mystics shared ideas eerily similar to the hidden teachings found in the Gospel of Mary. That salvation is inner transformation, not obedience. That wisdom is a direct experience, not a hierarchy. That the soul is both masculine and feminine. That divine truth is revealed through compassion, not control. Most mystics had no knowledge of the Templars' discoveries. Yet their teachings aligned perfectly, as though truth, once buried, still found ways to rise. Then came the troubadours of southern France. They sang of courtly love, a strange, idealized devotion that elevated the feminine to a near-sacred status. On the surface, their songs were about romance. But beneath the metaphors lay secret symbolism. The lady they praised was not mortal. She was wisdom. She was the feminine divine. She was the lost spiritual partner. Many troubadours came from regions where Templar influence was strong. Some scholars believe they encoded the forbidden teachings into their melodies, using love as a mask for devotion to Magdalene's spiritual authority. In one Occitan poem, a singer declares, "Through her, the path becomes whole," a line that resonates with Gnostic writings describing Mary as the one who completes the circle. The troubadours kept the feminine sacred alive through poetry. But philosophy carried it further. During the Renaissance, Europe awakened intellectually. And as scholars rediscovered ancient Greek and Middle Eastern texts, they began to question the narrow version of Christianity the Church had imposed. Hermetic philosophers wrote of divine balance. Kabbalists wrote of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Sufi mystics wrote of divine love expressed through the beloved. All these teachings, though coming from different cultures, shared a common essence. The divine is not one-sided. It is masculine and feminine. It is active and receptive. It is balanced. This idea mirrored the sacred teachings the Templars had guarded, teachings they believed Mary Magdalene embodied. And then came the alchemists, those strange, secretive seekers who tried to purify metals, or so people believed. Their true pursuit was the purification of the soul. Their diagrams showed two forces joining, the Red King and the White Queen, fire and water, sun and moon, masculine and feminine. Their texts spoke of a blood-red stone, representing divine wisdom. Their symbolism often centered on Sophia, the feminine face of God. Some alchemists explicitly referenced the woman in red, who holds the inner secret. Many believe this was Magdalene in disguise. And then, in the shadows, there were the Masons. Not the modern Freemasons yet, but the operative builders of cathedrals, the craftsmen who carved symbols into stone that priests could not interpret. These Masons were influenced by Templar refugees, by troubadour poetry, by local legends of Magdalene, and by the sacred feminine philosophies that seeped through Renaissance Europe. In their carvings, a familiar pattern emerged. Roses, chalices, vesica, piscis, labyrinths, female figures holding books, symbols of balance and union. They carried the Magdalene message in tools and stone. And then, slowly, Masons became Freemasons. Not by accident, but through evolution. Craft turned into ritual. Ritual turned into philosophy. Philosophy turned into brotherhood. Early Freemasonry contained astonishing parallels to Templar spirituality. Reverence for wisdom, Sophia. Concepts of inner transformation. Symbols of feminine balance. References to the widow, a mysterious figure some scholars connect to Magdalene. And above all, a deep respect for the sacred knowledge the Church rejected. Though Freemasonry later shifted toward Enlightenment ideals and away from overt spiritual symbolism, its earliest roots carried unmistakable echoes of Templar tradition. Alongside Freemasons, another group emerged, the Rosicrucians. Their earliest manifestos describe a woman of hidden wisdom, a keeper of sacred truth, a spiritual figure with a message long suppressed. Their symbol? A rose at the center of a cross. The rose, Magdalene's symbol. The cross, Templar legacy. Together, they created a hybrid emblem of everything Rome feared. Feminine wisdom united with masculine structure. Hidden truth brought into the light. A remembrance of balance. Rosicrucians championed inner revelation. They sought unity of opposites. They celebrated a divine feminine presence. Some even explicitly linked Magdalene to a lost line of spiritual teachings. By the time these movements matured, Europe had become a labyrinth of secret traditions, all guarding pieces of the same puzzle. A puzzle the Church tried to dismantle. A puzzle the Templars quietly preserved. A puzzle whose missing piece was a woman named Mary Magdalene. And across centuries, through mystics, Masons, poets, philosophers, and seekers, her teachings were not erased. They were transformed, turned into symbols, turned into rituals, turned into stories, turned into philosophies, turned into entire social movements. She had become not a person, but a current, a river flowing beneath Europe's spiritual landscape. A river the Templars once protected with armor and oath, now carried gently by hands that barely knew whose legacy they held. And yet, somehow they all carried it. Whether they recognized it or not, the Magdalene truth lived through them. Not perfectly, not always consciously, but always persistently, because truth has its own instincts. It seeks expression the way seeds seek sunlight. And the feminine truth suppressed by Rome found new soil in every age. Soft, hidden, fertile pockets of culture where it could quietly take root. Through poetry, through stone, through ritual, through philosophy, through art, through secret orders, through whispered stories, and through everyone who asked the forbidden question, what if the Church lied about her? In the end, truth does not need permission to survive. It only needs memory. And memory, as the Templars knew, is stronger than fire. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. The Church that once hunted the Templars splintered into 1,000 branches. Empires collapsed. Scientific revolutions rewrote the world. And still, beneath the surface, in the quiet spaces where memory hides, the Magdalene legacy refused to die. But by the modern era, something strange happened. For the first time in history, people began openly looking for what had been hidden. Not priests, not mystics, not secret societies. Ordinary people. Students, scholars, researchers, artists, skeptics, wanderers, thousands of them. All asking the same question the Templars whispered before they fell. What truth was buried? What story was rewritten? What voice was silenced? And the moment those questions cracked open, forgotten fragments of history began rising like bones from the earth. It started softly with archaeology. In the deserts of Egypt, a group of laborers dug into a cliff near the town of Nag Hammadi. Their spades struck a clay jar. Inside it were ancient papyrus codices, texts the church banned over 1,600 years earlier. And in those codices were the lost gospels of early Christianity, including the Gospel of Mary. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, Mary Magdalene spoke again. Her words were clear, calm, authoritative. She explained spiritual insight with a confidence the apostles struggled to match. She described union with the divine as inner discovery, not external law. This was not the Magdalene of Rome, not the penitent girl on her knees, not the prostitute fabricated by Gregory the Great. This was the teacher, the revealer, the woman the Templars had fought to protect. And with her voice came questions that shook the academic world. If her teachings were real, why were they suppressed? If she held authority, why was she erased? If she was central, why did the church bury her memory? But archaeology didn't stop in Egypt. In southern France, excavations near St. Maximin uncovered ancient Christian tombs, one of which tradition long claimed belonged to Mary Magdalene. Nearby, inscriptions referencing her appeared older than any medieval church records. In caves of St. Baume, archaeologists found carvings predating Roman influence, symbols linked to feminine divinity. Then came discoveries in Israel, where ruins revealed early Christian sects with surprisingly egalitarian practices. Some communities centered around female teachers. Some used symbols identical to those in Templar chapels. Some honored Mary Magdalene directly. And with every discovery, the church's narrative weakened. Then came anthropology. Researchers studying European folklore noticed something astonishing. Stories of the wandering holy woman, the teacher by the sea, and the Lady of the Red Egg appeared across regions with no official connection to Magdalene. These stories had lived in local memory for centuries, long before scholars rediscovered the apocryphal texts, long before popular theories revived interest, long before modern storytellers romanticized her. The people had always remembered, even when the church forgot on purpose. Then came the theologians. As more forbidden texts surfaced, scholars began comparing them to canonical scripture. They found contradictions not of faith but of politics. They uncovered councils where bishops argued over which gospels to include. They found letters describing the fear of confusion if Mary's teaching spreads. Fear, control, suppression. The pattern became undeniable. Then came the artists. Painters began depicting Magdalene not as the penitent sinner, but as a figure of power, a woman with books, scrolls, wisdom in her eyes. Writers began restoring her voice. Musicians composed hymns to her. Poets described her as the lost equal. And then came the scientists, anthropologists mapping symbolism, linguists studying textual patterns, mathematicians analyzing sacred geometry in Templar architecture. They all noticed the same anomaly. Symbols associated with Magdalene appeared in Templar, Cathar, Masonic, Rosicrucian, and even Renaissance artworks as though the memory never stopped flowing. Even psychologists joined the conversation. Carl Jung wrote of the anima, the feminine archetype suppressed by patriarchal religion. Maria Gimbutas uncovered ancient goddess cultures buried under later conquest. Scholars of myth recognized Magdalene as an archetype of lost feminine divinity. But the most unexpected revival came from a place no one predicted: modern seekers. Not religious, not academic, not political, human. People searching for meaning in a fractured world. People tired of rigid doctrine. People longing for balance. People craving a spirituality that reflected both halves of the human soul. They found in Magdalene something the church had failed to offer: compassion instead of punishment, wisdom instead of hierarchy, inner truth instead of external control. Her teachings offered a path of serenity, introspection, equality, grief transformed into strength, love transformed into understanding. It resonated, and as interest grew, more discoveries surfaced. In dusty monastery libraries, misfiled manuscripts finally re-emerged. In old cathedrals, forgotten carvings were uncovered. In basements of European museums, mislabeled boxes were opened. In private collections, coded paintings were re-examined. Each fragment added to a growing mosaic. A mosaic the Templars once protected in secrecy, but that modern minds reconstructed with clarity. And slowly, a picture formed. A picture of early Christianity that valued women. A picture of a teacher who understood the divine differently. A picture of communities where the feminine had a voice. A picture of a truth Rome tried to bury. But the revival wasn't just academic. It was emotional. People who felt excluded from traditional faith, especially women, found a model in Magdalene who did not require permission to be wise. Men who longed for spiritual balance saw in her a missing counterpart to the masculine image of Christ. Mystics saw in her the whisper of Sophia. Philosophers saw in her the embodiment of lost gnosis. Even some clergy began quietly acknowledging what history had hidden. A few priests began preaching that Magdalene was not a prostitute. Some bishops acknowledged the Church's mistakes. A handful of theologians urged the Vatican to restore her role. Pilgrims began flocking to her shrines in record numbers, not for repentance, but for connection. And somewhere in all this revival, in the caves of Saint Baume, in the chapels of Provence, in the echoing halls of Rosslyn, in the pages of the Gospel of Mary, in symbols carved across Europe, the Templar thread reappeared. Because everything the modern world rediscovered, the sacred feminine, the lost Gospels, the symbols of balance, the hidden role of Magdalene, was exactly what the Templars once guarded. Their mission did not end with their deaths. It simply became distributed, fragmented, carried by the world itself, waiting to be reassembled. And now, centuries later, we are finally doing what kings and popes once feared most. We are remembering. Not through secret orders, not through coded carvings, not through whispers in dusty cellars, but openly, curiously, fearlessly. The Templars protected a truth they believed the world was not ready for. Perhaps the world is ready now, because Magdalene's return is not myth, not speculation, not fantasy. It is history rising, memory resurfacing, truth resurfacing, balance resurfacing. A legacy once buried in caves and blood, now reborn in light. Across continents and centuries, a strange thread appears, quiet, persistent, impossible to dismiss. A thread connecting ancient Egypt to early Christianity, Jewish mysticism to Gnostic visions, Sufi poetry to Templar symbols. At first glance, these traditions seem unrelated. Different eras, different cultures, different languages. But when you look closely, you see a pattern the Church never wanted the world to notice. Every ancient tradition honored a feminine force at the center of spiritual awakening. And the Templars, more than any order of their age, encountered these traditions directly. They traveled through Egypt, where Isis was worshipped as healer, teacher, protector, revealer of hidden wisdom. They walked the streets of Jerusalem, where early Jewish mystics spoke of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. They listened to Sufi teachers describing divine love as a beloved who guides the soul inward. Everywhere they turned, the feminine was not weak. It was sacred. It was essential. It was half of the divine. Then they returned to Europe and saw something different. A church that erased the feminine from its theology. A church that demoted Mary Magdalene, silenced female teachers, banned feminine imagery, and reshaped Christ's message into a strictly masculine hierarchy. To Templar scholars, something was missing, something obvious once you had seen the older world. So the Templars began comparing what they learned abroad with what they found hidden beneath the Temple Mount. Fragments of early writings, hints of Gnostic teachings, whispers of communities where women had authority. They realized Magdalene wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a universal tradition. In Egypt, Isis restores life to Osiris. In Gnostic texts, Sophia brings divine knowledge. In Judaism, the Shekinah guides the people through exile. In Christianity, Mary Magdalene stands at the tomb, witnessing rebirth. The same pattern, the same role, the same truth, hidden in different forms. And this realization frightened the Church more than any sword. Because if Magdalene mirrored the ancient feminine divine, then her importance was far greater than a misunderstood disciple. She represented balance. She represented direct revelation. She represented the part of the divine the institution had cut away. The Templars understood this. Rome sensed they understood it, and conflict became inevitable. When the Church learned the Templars had seen too much, seen connections that unraveled centuries of control, the order was doomed. Not because of wealth or heresy, but because they had glimpsed a version of Christianity where the feminine returned to its rightful place. Today, modern scholars, mystics, and historians are rediscovering the same pattern that once transformed the Templars. Across all civilizations, the divine had two faces. Christianity, in suppressing the feminine, became unbalanced. Mary Magdalene carried the missing half. And now, as these ancient connections rise again, the truth the Templars protected begins to shine through. She was never meant to be erased. She was meant to be the key. There are moments in history when scattered pieces suddenly align, revealing a truth too vast to ignore. For centuries, Mary Magdalene's story lay fragmented, buried under dogma, hidden in symbols, whispered in remote traditions. But in the modern world, something extraordinary began to happen. Convergence, a merging of archaeology, mysticism, folklore, scholarship, and spiritual awakening. It did not rise from the Vatican's vaults. It rose from the edges, deserts, caves, forgotten manuscripts, folk memory. The Gospel of Mary resurfaced, revealing a woman who guided the disciples, taught spiritual insight, and understood Christ in ways others could not. Then came the Gospel of Philip, speaking of her closeness, her unique comprehension. Archaeologists found feminine symbols in early Christian communities. Folklorists uncovered stories preserved by villagers for 800 years. Psychologists began identifying a universal archetype of the lost feminine wisdom. Then researchers studying Templar chapels saw symbols repeating. Roses, intersecting circles, chalices, markings pointing toward a suppressed spiritual balance. The same symbols appeared in Qatar ruins, Rosicrucian manifestos, Masonic geometry. Different eras, different cultures, same pattern. Across disciplines, researchers who had never met were arriving at the same conclusion. Mary Magdalene was not erased because she was unimportant. She was erased because she mattered too much. A teacher, a revealer, a spiritual equal. Her suppression mirrored the suppression of the feminine itself. And her return now mirrors humanity's longing for balance between intellect and intuition, strength and compassion, masculine and feminine. The convergence is not a theory. It is a rising, and it marks the moment when the truth the Templars guarded in silence finally steps into light. If you stand today at the entrance of the cave of St. Baume, where legend claims Mary Magdalene prayed for decades, you will feel something ancient, something alive. Pilgrims describe it as presence, as if the cave remembers her, as if the earth itself protects her memory. Even skeptics fall silent, not because of superstition, because of recognition. For centuries, Magdalene was presented as a repentant sinner. Yet everywhere she was honored independently. France, Egypt, Scotland, Eastern Europe, people remembered her differently. As a teacher, a guide, a woman of light. Now, modern seekers are rediscovering what the Church tried to overwrite. And the realization is powerful. The erasure of Magdalene mirrors the erasure of the feminine in human spirituality. Her fall from teacher to penitent reflected a shift from balance to hierarchy. The world moved toward masculine systems, law over compassion, authority over insight, structure over intuition. And today humanity suffers that imbalance. Disconnection, spiritual emptiness, emotional fatigue. This is why Magdalene's story feels urgent today. Because her return is not about rewriting scripture. It's about healing something broken inside all of us. In the Gospel of Mary, her message is simple. The kingdom is within. Truth rises from the heart. Fear blinds. Authority is not the path. Understanding is. She represents spiritual freedom, not rebellion. Inner awakening, not chaos. balance, not domination. The Templars sensed this danger to institutional power. Her teachings empowered individuals, not systems. They knew the Church could not allow such autonomy. But today, her truth belongs to the world again. Not as myth, not as scandal, but as a way back to spiritual and emotional wholeness. Some revelations don't arrive in thunder. They arrive like dawn, quietly reshaping the world. The Magdalene revelation is one of them. After centuries of suppression, the question rising now is simple but transformative. What if Mary Magdalene was always meant to stand beside Jesus, not behind him? Not as a wife, not as a mythic figure, but as a co-teacher, a holder of the other half of the message. This possibility does not diminish Christ, it completes him, because ancient traditions across the world taught the same truth. Transformation requires balance. Masculine and feminine, action and intuition, logic and compassion. Jesus embodied many qualities, but the institutional Church stripped the feminine from his story. Early Christian communities were far more balanced. Archaeology confirms women preached, baptized, and led congregations. Inscriptions call them apostles. Texts show Magdalene guiding frightened disciples. She was not an accessory, she was essential. Rome's political system could not tolerate that. Empires need hierarchy. Hierarchy needs exclusion. And feminine authority was the greatest threat of all. But the world today is not bound by medieval fear. Humanity is experiencing a crisis of meaning, seeking spirituality that heals, not controls. Magdalene's return meets this need. She represents the part of the soul modern life has silenced. Intuition, compassion, emotional wisdom. Her message in the Gospel of Mary is revolutionary. Seek truth within. Fear nothing. Do not let institutions replace your inner guidance. This is why her restoration matters. Not for historical correction, but for humanity's spiritual healing. The Templars preserved this truth as potential, believing someday humanity would be ready. That someday is now. Some secrets are not meant to shatter the world. They are meant to heal it. The final revelation of the Magdalene mystery is not sensational. It does not rest on scandal, bloodlines, or lost relics. It rests on something far more powerful. Humanity was never meant to reject half of its spiritual nature. For 2,000 years, the feminine side of wisdom, intuition, compassion, inner knowing was suppressed. When Mary Magdalene was rewritten as a sinner, the feminine divine within humanity was wounded. People learned to trust authority over intuition, doctrine over conscience, fear over love. The Templars realized this imbalance. They encountered traditions across the world, Egyptian, Jewish, Gnostic, Sufi, that preserved the sacred feminine. They recognized Magdalene as Christianity's missing pillar, the one Rome erased to consolidate power. Their secret was never a weapon. It was a remedy for a world built on dominance instead of balance, a remedy for institutions that valued obedience over understanding, a remedy for individuals disconnected from their inner wisdom. Now, in a world facing emotional exhaustion, social fragmentation, and spiritual hunger, Magdalene's truth rises again, not as rebellion, but as restoration. Her return whispers, "You are whole." The divine is balanced. Wisdom has two voices. Let both speak. This is the truth the Templars died protecting. That Christ's message was never singular. It was dual, harmonious, complete. Masculine and feminine working together. Teacher and teacher. Light and light. We end not with closure, but with invitation. To restore balance. To reclaim inner truth. To see Mary Magdalene not as a shadow, but as a missing source of light. The secret is revealed. The story is whole. And the awakening begins.